The hour before darkness. Survival in a 1700s home. The wind always arrived before the darkness. Long before the stars appeared above the forests of colonial America, long before a single candle was lit inside a wooden farmhouse, there was an hour that every family respected more than any other. It was not the first hour of the morning, when the fields shimmered with dew, nor the busy hours of midday, when the sun warmed the crops. It was the quiet hour before sunset, the final 60 minutes of daylight, when every task became a race against the coming night. If you could step back nearly 300 years and stand beside a lonely farmhouse somewhere on the American frontier, you would notice something surprising. There would be no frantic shouting, no unnecessary movement, and no wasted effort. Everyone would know exactly what needed to be done. Children, parents, and even the family dog seemed to understand that darkness changed everything. This is the story of one such evening, not the story of a famous battle, not the story of a king or a president, but the story of an ordinary family whose peaceful evening reveals what life was truly like in the early 1700s. The farmhouse stood on a gentle rise overlooking fields of corn, pumpkins, beans, and rye. A split-rail fence surrounded the property, while a thick forest stretched endlessly beyond the last pasture. Tall white oaks, maples, chestnuts, and hickories covered the hills. To the west, the setting sun painted the sky with soft shades of gold and amber. The house itself was built almost entirely from hand-hewn oak logs. Every beam had been cut with an axe, shaped with broad tools, and lifted into place without modern machines. The stone chimney rose proudly from the center of the roof, quietly releasing a thin ribbon of smoke into the calm evening sky. Inside lived Thomas Carter, his wife Elizabeth, their daughter Mary, their son Samuel, and little Hannah, who had only recently learned to carry small buckets without spilling too much water. They were not wealthy. Most colonial families were not. Yet they possessed something far more valuable than luxury. They possessed knowledge, knowledge passed from parents to children. Knowledge that meant the difference between comfort and hardship, sometimes even the difference between life and death. As Thomas looked toward the western horizon, he quietly judged the position of the sun. Few families owned accurate clocks during the early 1700s. Instead, they relied upon nature itself. The length of shadows, the songs of birds, the coolness of the evening breeze, and years of experience told them almost exactly how much daylight remained. "There is about an hour left," he said calmly. No one questioned him. No one needed to. Immediately, everyone began their evening routine. Elizabeth walked toward the great stone fireplace that served as the heart of the home. Throughout colonial America, nearly every activity centered around the hearth. Meals were prepared there. Clothes were dried there. Families gathered around its warmth during freezing winters. Stories were shared beside its glow, and children often fell asleep listening to the gentle crackling of burning oak logs. She carefully examined the fire. The coals still glowed a deep orange beneath the ashes. Using a long iron poker, she gently stirred them until tiny sparks floated upward. Then she placed 2 seasoned oak logs onto the fire. Freshly cut wood contained far too much moisture and burned poorly. Experienced colonial families often allowed firewood to dry for 1 or even 2 years before using it. Historians estimate that an average household could burn more than 20 cords of wood during a single winter. That meant hundreds of trees, thousands of swings of an axe, months of labor. Outside, Samuel hurried toward the chicken coop. The hens had already begun gathering near the entrance. Animals often recognized the approach of darkness before humans did. Chickens naturally returned to their roosts, while wild birds disappeared into nearby trees. Samuel counted carefully, 1, 2, 3, until all 14 hens were safely inside. He closed the wooden door and fastened the heavy latch. Foxes became especially active after sunset. So did raccoons. A single forgotten chicken could easily become a night's meal for a hungry predator. Nearby stood the small barn. Inside waited the family's milk cow, 2 pigs, and 6 sheep. Each animal represented months of work and careful care. The cow provided fresh milk. The sheep supplied wool for warm clothing. The pigs would eventually provide meat for the coming winter. Losing even one animal could make life much more difficult. Thomas slowly inspected every fence post before closing the pasture gate. A loose rail might allow livestock to wander into the forest overnight. Recovering them could take days. Sometimes they were never found again. Meanwhile, Mary entered the pantry. Unlike modern kitchens filled with refrigerators and freezers, colonial pantries depended entirely upon careful preservation. Rows of glass jars did not yet exist. Instead, food rested inside wooden barrels, ceramic crocks, woven baskets and cloth sacks, salted pork, dried beans, cornmeal, smoked fish, apples stored beneath layers of straw, herbs hanging upside down from wooden rafters. Everything had been carefully prepared long before winter arrived. Nothing could be wasted. Food represented security. Every loaf of bread, every handful of grain, and every dried apple had required months of patient work. Elizabeth measured coarse flour into a wooden bowl. Tomorrow morning's bread would begin before sunrise. Good bread required planning. The dough often rested overnight before baking beside the glowing fireplace. Even simple meals reflected careful organization. Outside, Thomas lowered a wooden bucket into the family's well. The rope creaked softly against the weathered pulley. Cool water splashed far below. Moments later, he lifted the heavy bucket back toward the surface. Water was collected before darkness whenever possible. Walking outside after sunset always carried additional risks: uneven ground, hidden tree roots, wild animals, or simply becoming disoriented beneath the moonlight. Bringing enough water indoors before nightfall was simply common sense. Little Hannah carefully placed smooth river stones around the fireplace. She loved helping her mother, even if her small tasks seemed unimportant. Elizabeth smiled warmly. Every member of the family contributed. Even the youngest children learned responsibility from an early age. There were no idle evenings. Life itself depended upon cooperation. As the sun slipped lower, the forest slowly changed. The cheerful songs of robins faded. Blue jays disappeared among distant branches. Only the occasional call of a crow echoed across the fields. Then came another sound: silence. A deep, peaceful silence unlike anything experienced in most modern towns. Without highways, airplanes, engines, or electrical equipment, the countryside became astonishingly quiet. Only the wind moved gently through the tall oak trees. Thomas paused for a moment. He breathed deeply. The cool autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke, damp leaves, and freshly turned soil. It was a smell familiar to nearly every colonial farmer, a smell that meant home, a smell that meant another day's work had nearly ended. And yet, the most important hour of the day was only just beginning. The last rays of sunlight stretched across the fields like long golden ribbons, slowly retreating toward the western horizon. Shadows from the oak trees reached farther with every passing minute, quietly covering the vegetable garden, the split-rail fence, and finally the front steps of the farmhouse. Thomas watched them carefully. After so many years on the frontier, he hardly needed the sun itself to tell the time. The shadows spoke clearly enough. For families living in the American colonies during the early 18th century, evening was never simply the end of the day. It marked the beginning of another kind of work, slower, quieter, and just as important. Every task completed before darkness made the coming night a little safer. Thomas carried another armful of seasoned oak into the house, placing each log neatly beside the hearth. He never stacked them carelessly. Dry wood had taken years to prepare, and every piece mattered. During especially harsh winters, snow could cover the ground for weeks, making fresh trips to the woods nearly impossible. Families who failed to prepare enough firewood often paid a terrible price. Historical records from colonial settlements tell of winters when entire communities struggled through freezing nights because their woodpiles disappeared too soon. The fire crackled gently as Elizabeth adjusted the iron cooking crane suspended over the glowing coals. The evening meal had already been served. Thick vegetable stew with small pieces of salted pork, coarse bread baked only yesterday, and fresh butter churned earlier that morning. Nothing remained except a few crusts that would become tomorrow's breakfast. Modern kitchens encouraged leftovers. Colonial kitchens discouraged waste. Even stale bread found a purpose. It might become soup thickener, stuffing, or breadcrumbs. Every potato peel could feed pigs. Vegetable scraps became compost for next year's garden. Survival rewarded careful habits. Mary carefully folded clean linen towels beside the cupboard. Most clothing and household fabric had been made by hand. The linen itself began as flax grown in nearby fields. The fibers had been harvested, soaked, beaten, spun into thread, and woven into cloth over many months. A single shirt represented dozens of hours of patient labor. Because clothing required so much effort, people owned far fewer garments than most Americans today. Many adults owned only 2 or 3 everyday outfits. Children often inherited clothing from older brothers and sisters. Patches were signs of wisdom, not embarrassment. A well-repaired coat demonstrated responsibility. Little Hannah sat quietly near the fireplace, watching her grandmother's old spinning wheel. Elizabeth gently turned the wheel while twisting soft wool into long strands of yarn. The steady rhythm filled the room with a peaceful sound that almost resembled quiet breathing. Whir, click, whir, click. It was one of the most familiar sounds inside colonial homes. Before textile factories transformed the world, spinning thread occupied countless evening hours across America. Families often worked together while sharing stories, singing hymns, or simply enjoying comfortable silence. Outside, Samuel walked slowly around the barn carrying a small lantern. Its warm flame barely reached beyond a few feet. That was enough. Lanterns were not designed to flood the darkness with light. They simply guided careful footsteps. He inspected each stall once more. The milk cow chewed hay peacefully. The sheep rested close together for warmth. The pigs had already settled into thick bedding made from clean straw. Satisfied, Samuel closed the heavy barn door. Above him, the evening sky continued changing. The brilliant gold slowly softened into orange. Orange gradually faded into deep crimson. Finally, delicate shades of purple stretched across the horizon. Without city lights, sunsets in colonial America often appeared astonishingly vivid. Travelers frequently wrote about skis so colorful they seemed almost painted by hand. Thomas stood quietly for a moment. He never rushed this part of the day. Watching the sunset reminded him that another successful day had passed. His crops had survived. His family remained healthy. His animals were safe. For frontier families, those simple blessings could never be taken for granted. Life remained uncertain. A violent storm, a failed harvest, disease, a harsh winter, any one of them could change everything. Perhaps that uncertainty explains why ordinary evenings felt so precious. Inside, Elizabeth carefully trimmed the wick of one tallow candle before lighting it from the fireplace. The tiny flame flickered softly, casting long shadows across the wooden walls. Tallow candles were made from rendered animal fat. They burned with a faint smoky smell and required frequent trimming to prevent excessive soot. Beeswax candles were brighter and smelled sweeter, but they were also more expensive. Most families saved them for Christmas, weddings, or church gatherings. Tonight, the humble tallow candle served perfectly well. Its small circle of light reached only the nearby table. Beyond that circle, the room slowly disappeared into comfortable darkness. Modern homes often chase away every shadow. Colonial homes accepted them. Darkness was not an enemy. It was simply another part of life. Mary opened the heavy family Bible. Books were rare possessions during the early 1700s. Printing presses existed, but books remained costly and precious. Many households owned only 1 or 2 volumes, usually a Bible and perhaps an almanac filled with farming advice, weather observations, and practical knowledge. Thomas gathered the children around the table. Before bedtime, many colonial families ended the day with quiet reading or prayer. The practice brought comfort after long hours of physical work. Outside, the final birds settled into the forest canopy. The wind moved gently through towering chestnut trees. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once, then again. Its low voice drifted across the darkening countryside before fading into silence. The first stars slowly appeared above the farmhouse, one by one, then dozens, then hundreds. Without electric lights washing out the heavens, the night sky revealed itself in breathtaking detail. The Milky Way stretched overhead like a pale river of light. familiar to every traveler, farmer, hunter, and sailor of the 18th century. Long before accurate maps reached every settlement, many people could navigate simply by studying the stars. Thomas stepped outside once more, not because another chore remained, but because this quiet moment belonged to him. He looked upward. The cool evening breeze brushed gently across his face. The fields rested peacefully. The barn stood silent. The chimney released a thin ribbon of smoke into the starlit sky. Everything was ready. The house had entered the long hours of darkness, and somewhere beyond the peaceful edge of the forest, unseen eyes had already begun to wake. The night settled over the countryside with remarkable patience. There was no sudden curtain of darkness, no instant transformation. Instead, the daylight slowly surrendered to the evening, allowing every hill, tree, and fence post to soften into quiet silhouettes beneath the growing sky. The stars multiplied until they seemed countless, scattered across the heavens with a brilliance that few modern Americans have ever experienced. Without electric lights, highways, or glowing cities, the night sky became one of nature's greatest masterpieces. Thomas remained outside for another moment. He tilted his head upward. The familiar constellations slowly appeared one after another. The Big Dipper rested low above the northern trees. Cassiopeia shimmered on the opposite side of the sky. Countless frontier travelers depended upon these same stars to guide their journeys through forests, across rivers, and over distant mountains. Long before accurate road maps existed, the heavens themselves served as trusted companions. A cool breeze drifted through the tall chestnut trees, carrying the rich scent of damp earth, fallen leaves, pine needles, and wood smoke. Somewhere beyond the edge of the clearing, a small stream continued its endless journey over smooth stones, producing a gentle sound almost like whispered conversation. Thomas smiled quietly. He had listened to that stream nearly every evening for 15 years. Its peaceful rhythm never changed. Back inside the farmhouse, Elizabeth carefully placed a heavy iron kettle near the edge of the fireplace. The remaining warmth from the glowing coals would keep the water comfortably warm until morning. Nothing was rushed inside a colonial home. Even simple tasks were planned carefully to save both fuel and effort. The children gathered around the wide wooden table. Mary continued spinning wool beneath the soft light of the candle. Samuel carefully repaired a leather strap used for guiding the family's horse. Leather goods required constant attention. Rain, snow, and everyday use slowly weakened them. A small tear repaired tonight could prevent a much larger problem during tomorrow's work. Little Hannah rested her head against her mother's shoulder. Her eyelids grew heavier with every passing minute. Outside, the forest slowly awakened. The daytime birds had completely disappeared. Now the creatures of the night quietly emerged. An owl glided silently between towering oaks. Its wings produced almost no sound. Far below, a rabbit cautiously left its hiding place, stopping every few steps to listen for danger. A fox moved through the underbrush with patient confidence, its sharp ears searching for the slightest movement beneath the fallen leaves. Much of colonial America remained true wilderness during the early 18th century. Millions of acres of untouched forest stretched across the eastern colonies. White-tailed deer wandered freely. Black bears searched for berries before winter. Beavers built impressive dams along quiet rivers. Even wolves still roamed many regions, though they usually avoided human settlements whenever possible. Despite popular legends, wild animals rarely attacked people without reason. Most preferred distance over conflict. The Carter family understood this well. They respected nature. They did not fear every sound beyond the trees. Instead, they listened carefully, recognizing the voices of the forest almost as neighbors. A barred owl called from somewhere across the creek. Its familiar cry echoed through the darkness. Samuel looked toward the window and smiled. "He's back," he whispered. Thomas nodded. "He hunts the mice around the barn." Family welcomed the owl. Every mouse it caught meant less grain lost during the winter. Nature often provided its own quiet balance. The candle flame flickered gently as a cool draft slipped beneath the front door. Elizabeth stood, walked across the room, and placed a tightly rolled cloth along the bottom of the door. Colonial homes rarely fit together perfectly. Tiny openings allowed cold air to enter throughout the year. Families constantly searched for small ways to keep precious warmth inside. The room became noticeably cozier. The fire glowed steadily. The iron kettle released a faint cloud of steam. Fresh bread, dried herbs, wood smoke, beeswax polish, and burning oak blended into a comforting scent that filled every corner of the house. Modern historians often describe colonial homes as simple. They certainly were. But simple did not mean uncomfortable. Everything inside served a purpose. Every chair had been built by hand. Every blanket had been stitched carefully over many months. Every wooden spoon had been carved with patience. Beauty came not from decoration, but from usefulness. Mary finally set aside her spinning wheel. Her hands had produced several more yards of fine wool thread before bedtime. That thread would eventually become warm stockings, blankets, or winter clothing. Nothing happened quickly during the 18th century. Nearly every object required days, weeks, or even months to complete. People measured life differently. They measured it through seasons instead of schedules, harvests instead of deadlines, sunrises instead of alarm clocks. Outside, the moon slowly climbed above the eastern forest. Tonight it was nearly full. Its silver light spread gently across the fields, making the frost-covered grass sparkle like thousands of tiny crystals. The split-rail fence cast long, pale shadows over the ground, while the farmhouse itself stood quietly beneath the vast American sky. Thomas opened the front door once more, not because he expected visitors. Travel after dark remained uncommon unless absolutely necessary. Instead, he simply enjoyed the peaceful silence. He listened. No wagon wheels, no distant voices, no machinery, only the wind moving softly through branches hundreds of years old. It is difficult for many people today to imagine such complete quiet. Modern life surrounds us with constant sound, cars, televisions, airplanes, phones. In the early 1700s, silence itself became part of everyday life. It allowed people to notice small things, the crackle of a fire, the rustle of dry leaves, the distant splash of a fish in the creek, the steady breathing of sleeping animals inside the barn. These gentle sounds created a world that moved slowly, inviting patience instead of hurry. Thomas closed the door softly. The wooden latch settled into place with a quiet click. The family gathered once more around the warm fireplace. No one felt the need to speak. The fire provided enough conversation on its own. Orange flames danced lazily around blackened oak logs. Tiny sparks drifted upward before disappearing into the chimney. The warmth spread throughout the room, wrapping the family in quiet comfort while the endless wilderness rested peacefully beyond their walls. For another night, the little farmhouse had done exactly what it was built to do. It had become a place of safety, a small island of warmth and light surrounded by miles of silent forest, beneath a sky filled with stars that had watched over America long before the first settlers arrived. The fire settled into a slow and steady rhythm, its gentle crackling becoming almost hypnotic. Every few moments, a glowing ember drifted upward through the chimney, disappearing into the darkness above the roof. Inside the farmhouse, the warmth lingered comfortably against the thick log walls, while outside the autumn air grew colder with each passing hour. Elizabeth quietly stood from her chair and walked toward the small window nearest the fireplace. She carefully lifted one corner of the cloth curtain just enough to look outside. Moonlight covered the fields like a silver blanket. The corn had already been harvested weeks before, leaving only neat rows of short stalks that shimmered beneath the frost. Beyond them, the orchard stood perfectly still. Bare apple branches reached toward the sky like delicate black lace against the brilliant stars. She smiled. Tomorrow would likely bring another clear day. Colonial families learned to read the weather by careful observation rather than forecasts. The color of sunrise, the movement of clouds, the direction of the wind, even the behavior of birds often revealed what the next day might bring. Farmers paid close attention because their harvests depended upon understanding nature. Thomas reached for a wooden chair positioned near the hearth. It had been built nearly 10 years earlier from white oak harvested on the family's own land. The chair showed countless scratches, smooth edges worn by years of use, and tiny marks left by tools that had shaped it by hand. Nothing inside the house had come from a factory. Almost everything had been made by someone the family knew. Neighbors built tables. Local blacksmiths forged iron hinges. Wheelwrights repaired wagons. Coopers crafted sturdy barrels for storing grain and salted meat. Every settlement depended upon skilled craftsmen whose knowledge had been passed down through generations. Money itself was often scarce. Instead of paying with coins, many families exchanged goods and services. A farmer might trade wheat for new horseshoes. A carpenter could repair a roof in exchange for smoked ham. A seamstress might receive fresh butter instead of cash. This simple system helped small communities survive together. The children sat quietly as Thomas opened the family's treasured Bible. Its thick leather cover had faded over the years, while many pages showed dark fingerprints from countless evenings exactly like this one. Books remained precious possessions. During the early 18th century, printing existed, but books were still expensive enough that many homes owned only a handful. Some families possessed only one. Children often learned to read from the Bible because there were few other books available. Thomas read slowly. His calm voice blended with the soft sound of burning wood. Even little Hannah, who understood only some of the words, listened peacefully simply because the familiar rhythm comforted her. Outside, a gentle breeze stirred the fallen leaves. They drifted across the yard with a dry, whispering sound before collecting beside the split-rail fence. Somewhere deep within the woods, a white-tailed deer stepped carefully through the undergrowth. Its large ears turned toward every unfamiliar sound. The forest remained full of life during the night. Raccoons searched along the creek banks for crayfish and mussels. Possums wandered quietly beneath ancient trees. Flying squirrels glided from branch to branch beneath the moonlight, using loose folds of skin to sail silently through the air. Most colonial families knew these animals well. They shared the landscape every day. Nature was not something visited on weekends. It surrounded every moment of life. As the evening continued, Mary carefully added another small log to the fireplace. She had learned exactly how to place the wood without smothering the glowing coals. Too much wood wasted fuel. Too little allowed the fire to fade. Managing a household fire was a skill developed over many years. There were no matches waiting inside kitchen drawers. If the fire accidentally died during the night, someone might need to borrow burning coals from a neighbor the following morning, sometimes walking miles through snow or rain. Because of that, many colonial families tried to keep at least a few hot embers alive day and night. Elizabeth placed a cast iron lid over the glowing coals, allowing them to burn slowly until dawn. This simple practice saved both time and precious firewood. Samuel stretched quietly before carrying a small wooden bucket toward the pantry. Inside lay the family's winter supply. Large barrels of salted pork rested against one wall. Strings of dried onions hung from ceiling beams. Bundles of herbs filled the room with the pleasant scent of sage, thyme, rosemary, and mint. Pumpkins, squash, and turnips waited patiently beneath layers of straw nearby. Several crocks held pickled vegetables preserved in vinegar. Without refrigeration, preserving food demanded creativity and experience. Colonial families mastered drying, smoking, salting, fermenting, and pickling long before modern technology existed. These traditional methods allowed harvests gathered during autumn to feed families throughout long winters. The pantry itself remained surprisingly cool. Thick walls and careful construction helped protect food from extreme temperatures. Thomas often joked that the pantry was the quietest room in the house. Nothing inside ever hurried. Everything simply waited for its proper season. The moon climbed higher above the trees. Its pale light reached even the narrow footpath leading toward the nearby well. The bucket still rested safely beneath its wooden cover. Thomas always replaced the lid after drawing water. Not only did it keep leaves and insects out, but it also prevented small animals from accidentally falling inside. Practical habits like these became second nature after years of frontier living. Before long, the grandfather clock standing against the far wall quietly struck another hour. Its deep chime echoed gently through the farmhouse. 1, 2, 3. The sound faded almost immediately into silence. Clocks remained uncommon luxuries during the early 1700s. Many families measured time by sunrise, sunset, and church bells instead. Those fortunate enough to own a clock treated it with great care, winding it faithfully every week. Thomas glanced toward the window once again. The stars still shone brilliantly above the dark forest. The air had become colder now. Thin frost coated the roof. The fields rested peacefully beneath the silver glow of the moon. No travelers appeared along the narrow dirt road. No wagons disturbed the quiet night. The entire countryside seemed to breathe slowly together. Inside the farmhouse, the warmth of the fire, the comforting scent of oak smoke, and the gentle ticking of the old clock wrapped around the family like a soft blanket. Another ordinary evening in colonial America was passing exactly as thousands of others had before it, calm, patient, and beautifully simple. Yet within that ordinary rhythm lay the quiet wisdom that had allowed generations of frontier families to endure, one peaceful night after another. The hours moved gently across the little farmhouse, almost unnoticed. No one hurried them. No one wished them away. In the early 1700s, people rarely measured life by the minute. Instead, they measured it by the changing seasons, the ripening of crops, the arrival of migrating birds, and the familiar cycle of sunrise and sunset. Time felt slower, not because the days were longer, but because every moment had a purpose. The fire continued to glow beneath its bed of ash. Its bright flames had softened into deep orange embers that quietly radiated warmth throughout the room. Every so often, a small piece of oak shifted with a gentle pop, sending a shower of tiny sparks dancing upward before disappearing into the dark chimney. Elizabeth carefully folded another wool blanket and placed it at the foot of Hannah's bed. The blanket itself carried its own history. Months earlier, the family's sheep had been sheared during late spring. The wool had been washed in the creek, dried beneath the summer sun, combed by hand, spun into thread upon the old spinning wheel, and finally woven into thick cloth before being stitched together with countless patient stitches. Nothing inside the house appeared overnight. Everything told a story. The wooden table had once been a towering white oak standing proudly on the edge of the forest. The iron kettle had begun its life inside the glowing forge of a village blacksmith. Even the smooth floorboards beneath their feet had once echoed with the songs of birds high among the branches. Every object reminded the family that nature had provided nearly everything they owned. Thomas quietly opened the heavy front door once again. The cold night air greeted him immediately. He stepped onto the porch, closing the door softly behind him, so the warmth remained inside. Above him stretched one of the clearest skies imaginable. Thousands upon thousands of stars shimmered across the heavens. The Milky Way arched overhead like a broad river of pale silver, reaching from one horizon to the other. Many colonial Americans believed that simply standing beneath such a sky reminded them how small their own troubles truly were. There were no distant city lights to dull the stars. No aircraft crossed the heavens. No satellites drifted silently overhead. Only the ancient sky that generations before him had also admired. Thomas drew a slow breath. The cool air smelled wonderfully clean, fresh pine, dry leaves, rich soil, a faint trace of wood smoke rising from neighboring farms many miles away. Even scents traveled differently across the quiet countryside. Some evenings, people could smell rain long before the clouds arrived. Other nights carried the distant fragrance of freshly cut hay or blooming wildflowers. Experienced farmers trusted their senses almost as much as their eyes. From somewhere deep within the forest came the distant howl of a lone wolf. It was neither loud nor threatening. Simply a reminder that the wilderness still surrounded every colonial settlement. Contrary to popular stories, wolves rarely approached occupied homes. They preferred deer, rabbits, and other wild prey. Still, hearing their voices beneath the stars reminded families that civilization remained small compared to the endless forests stretching across North America. Thomas listened for a moment. Then he smiled. The howl faded into silence almost as quickly as it had appeared. Inside, Mary carefully placed another small candle onto the table before gently extinguishing the first. People often carried flames from one candle to another, rather than striking a fresh spark. Every bit of tallow mattered. Every wick had value. Even the tiny pools of melted wax left behind would later be collected and reused whenever possible. Waste belonged to no successful household. Samuel finished polishing the family's only hunting musket. Firearms during the early 18th century required constant maintenance. Black powder left residue inside the barrel after every use. Moisture encouraged rust. A neglected musket might fail exactly when it was needed most. Fortunately, the Carter family rarely depended upon it. The nearby woods provided enough game, but Thomas believed hunting should never exceed necessity. Taking only what the family needed ensured that deer, turkey, and rabbits remained plentiful for future seasons. Such practical respect for nature appeared throughout colonial life. The forests supplied timber, the rivers supplied fish, the fields supplied grain, the meadows fed livestock. Families understood that careless use today could create hardship tomorrow. Little Hannah had already fallen asleep. Her breathing rose and fell gently beneath the thick wool blanket. A handmade rag doll rested beside her pillow, stitched from scraps of old fabric that might otherwise have been discarded. Children in colonial America often created their own toys. Wooden tops, hoops rolled with sticks, simple dolls, carved whistles, small boats floated along creeks after spring rains. Entertainment required imagination more than possessions. Elizabeth quietly smiled as she watched her daughter sleep. Childhood looked different 3 centuries ago. Children began helping with household responsibilities at surprisingly young ages. They gathered eggs, collected firewood, fetched water, fed chickens. Learned sewing, gardening, spinning, cooking, or carpentry by watching their parents every single day. Education came not only from books, but from daily life itself. Outside, frost slowly formed across the pasture. Each blade of grass sparkled beneath the moonlight like tiny pieces of crystal. The old split-rail fence cast long silver shadows over the ground, while the barn stood peacefully beneath the towering sycamore tree that had shaded the farm since long before the first settlers arrived. Thomas finally returned indoors. He secured the wooden latch. Then, almost out of habit, he checked it once more. Locks during the colonial period were often simple but sturdy, built by skilled blacksmiths who forged each piece by hand. Many frontier families relied more upon strong doors, loyal dogs, and trusted neighbors than elaborate security. The warmth welcomed him immediately. He removed his heavy wool coat and hung it beside the fireplace. For a few quiet moments, no one spoke. There was no need. The ticking clock, the gentle breathing of sleeping children, the crackling embers, the whisper of wind outside. Together, they created a peaceful evening melody unlike anything the modern world could easily reproduce. This quiet hour before midnight was often a family's favorite. The day's labor had ended. Tomorrow's work had not yet begun. For just a little while, they could simply exist within the comforting embrace of their small wooden home, grateful for shelter, warmth, food, and one another. Beyond the walls, the great American wilderness stretched for hundreds of miles beneath the brilliant stars. But inside, surrounded by firelight and familiar voices, the farmhouse felt like the safest place in the world. And as the glowing embers slowly settled into an even gentler warmth, the long colonial night continued its peaceful journey toward dawn. Long before the first hint of dawn touched the eastern horizon, the farmhouse rested in complete stillness. The fire no longer burned with bright flames. Instead, a quiet bed of glowing embers rested beneath a blanket of soft gray ash, releasing just enough warmth to keep the chill from settling inside the room. Thomas had learned many years earlier that a carefully tended fire could survive the entire night without wasting precious wood. Before going to bed, he always arranged the larger logs close together and covered the hottest coals with ash. By morning, a few glowing embers usually remained, ready to awaken with nothing more than fresh kindling and a gentle breath of air. This simple practice was followed in thousands of homes throughout colonial America. Starting a completely new fire every morning was possible, but it required extra time and effort. Flint and steel could produce sparks, yet turning those tiny sparks into a dependable cooking fire demanded patience, dry tinder, and favorable conditions. Keeping the previous day's fire alive was simply easier. Outside, the moon had climbed high above the forest. Its pale light rested upon the rooftops, fences, and sleeping fields with remarkable softness. Frost now covered nearly everything. The grass sparkled like countless tiny diamonds, while the narrow dirt road leading toward the neighboring settlement appeared almost white beneath the moonlight. The countryside seemed asleep, yet countless lives quietly continued beyond human sight. A family of foxes emerged from their underground den to search for mice among the harvested fields. A beaver swam silently through the nearby creek, carrying a freshly cut branch toward its lodge, far overhead. A great horned owl perched upon an ancient oak branch, patiently watching the forest floor below. Nature never truly slept. It simply changed shifts. Day belonged to some creatures, night belonged to others. The Carter family understood this balance well. They had learned to respect it rather than disturb it. Inside the farmhouse, the heavy grandfather clock continued marking the hours with dependable precision. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Its steady rhythm blended perfectly with the quiet breathing of the sleeping family. Thomas often believed that the clock sounded almost like a second heartbeat for the house itself. The old timepiece had crossed the Atlantic many years earlier aboard a wooden sailing ship. It had survived rough seas, storms, and months of travel before finally standing inside this humble farmhouse. Every Sunday evening, Thomas carefully wound its brass weights, ensuring that it would continue faithfully measuring another week of frontier life. Around the room, familiar objects rested peacefully in the candlelight's absence. The spinning wheel stood silently beside the fireplace. Bundles of dried herbs still hung from ceiling beams, filling the room with the faint scents of sage, lavender, mint, and thyme. Iron cooking pots reflected the gentle glow of the remaining embers. A wooden cradle, no longer needed as the children grew older, remained tucked quietly into one corner, preserved as a reminder of earlier years. Nothing inside the house felt unnecessary. Every object carried memories. Every object had earned its place. During the colonial era, replacing household goods was neither quick nor inexpensive. Furniture was repaired rather than discarded. Iron tools passed from one generation to the next. Wooden bowls might remain in daily use for decades, growing smoother each year from countless hands washing, stirring, serving, and cleaning. Modern life often celebrates new possessions. Colonial life celebrated lasting ones. Outside, a gentle mist slowly formed above the creek. As warmer water met the cold night air, thin ribbons of fog drifted quietly across the meadow. Moonlight transformed the mist into soft silver clouds that floated only a few feet above the ground before slowly disappearing among the trees. If a traveler happened to pass this lonely farmhouse during the night, the sight would have seemed almost magical. A single chimney releasing a thin trail of smoke. One peaceful home resting beneath an endless sky. Beyond it, forests stretching farther than the eye could see. The stars themselves seemed brighter than the land below. Many early visitors to North America wrote about these astonishing night skies. Without artificial light, they could clearly see thousands of stars invisible to future generations living in growing cities. Sailors crossing the Atlantic, hunters traveling deep forests, and settlers building new homes all relied upon those brilliant constellations for both navigation and inspiration. Inside, Elizabeth stirred gently beneath her wool blanket. She did not fully awaken. Years of caring for children had simply taught her to notice every small sound. A shifting log, a change in the wind, the distant bark of a fox. Even while sleeping, mothers remained quietly attentive. Hearing nothing unusual, she settled comfortably once more. The farmhouse itself seemed to breathe. The thick oak beams expanded and contracted almost imperceptibly as temperatures changed throughout the night. Occasionally, a floorboard gave a soft creak. A roof beam answered with another gentle sound. To anyone unfamiliar with old wooden homes, these noises might seem mysterious. To the Carter family, they were simply part of the house's nightly conversation. Thomas had once told Samuel that every old home had its own voice. "You only need enough patience to hear it," he had said. Samuel never forgot those words. Beyond the barn, the family's milk cow rested peacefully upon a bed of fresh straw. Her slow breathing filled the quiet building with warmth. The sheep slept close together, conserving heat beneath their thick wool. Even the horses lowered their heads comfortably, occasionally flicking their ears at the faint sounds drifting through the night. Animals followed rhythms far older than clocks. They rose with daylight, rested with darkness, lived according to the steady turning of the seasons. Perhaps that is why life moved with such calm certainty. Nothing hurried spring, nothing delayed autumn. The forests changed exactly when they always had. Rivers continued flowing toward distant oceans. The moon completed its endless journey across the heavens. And within this quiet farmhouse, another peaceful colonial night continued exactly as thousands had before, wrapped in warmth, patience, and the comforting knowledge that when morning finally arrived, a new day would begin just as gently as the last one had ended. At last, the eastern horizon began to change. It happened so slowly that only someone who spent much of life outdoors would have noticed it. The deep black of the night softened into a rich navy blue. Above the distant hills, a thin silver line appeared, almost as if the sky itself had quietly taken a long, gentle breath. The stars, so brilliant only moments before, began fading one by one. The night was not ending with drama. It was simply making room for another day. Long before alarm clocks or ringing telephones, nature itself woke the countryside. The first sound was not the crow of a rooster, as many stories suggest. More often, it was the faint rustle of leaves stirred by the cool morning breeze. Then came the distant song of a single bird testing the silence. Soon another answered. Within minutes, the forest slowly filled with music. Thomas opened his eyes. For a few moments, he remained perfectly still, listening. The fire still held a few glowing embers. Good. That meant less work. He quietly slipped from beneath his blanket so he would not wake the others. Pulling on thick wool socks and sturdy leather boots, he crossed the wooden floor with practiced steps that avoided the boards most likely to creak. The room remained cool. The warmth of the previous evening had slowly faded, reminding everyone that autumn was steadily giving way to winter. Thomas knelt before the hearth. Using a small iron poker, he gently pulled apart the layer of ash covering the coals. A tiny orange glow appeared, then another. He smiled. Taking a handful of dry tinder made from shredded bark, dried grass, and small wood shavings, he carefully arranged it above the embers. A few gentle breaths were all it took. The tinder began to smoke. A moment later, a tiny flame appeared, then another. Within minutes, the fireplace was alive again, filling the room with gentle warmth and the comforting scent of burning oak. For colonial families, this simple morning success brought quiet satisfaction. A living fire meant warm food, warm hands, and another productive day ahead. Elizabeth awoke shortly afterward. Without saying a word, she began preparing breakfast. There was no need for complicated recipes. Morning meals were usually simple but filling. Cornmeal porridge simmered slowly in the iron kettle, while fresh milk from yesterday rested in a cool earthenware jug. A few slices of coarse bread were warmed beside the fire, their crust becoming pleasantly crisp. Breakfast needed to provide energy for long hours of physical labor. Luxury rarely appeared on the table. Nutrition did. As the aroma of warm porridge filled the room, the children slowly began waking. Mary stretched quietly before folding her blanket with neat, practiced movements. Samuel rubbed the sleep from his eyes before immediately reaching for his boots. Even little Hannah knew that every blanket should be folded before the day truly began. Order was part of everyday life, not because anyone demanded perfection, but because organized homes made difficult lives a little easier. Outside, the frost glittered beneath the first golden rays of sunlight. Each blade of grass seemed decorated with tiny crystals that sparkled brilliantly before slowly melting away. A rabbit darted across the field toward the safety of a hedgerow, while several squirrels hurried among the branches collecting the last remaining acorns before winter arrived. Thomas stepped outside carrying 2 empty buckets. The morning air felt sharp against his face. He paused for a moment, breathing deeply. The smell of wet earth mixed with fresh wood smoke drifting from neighboring farms. Somewhere far across the valley, another family had already awakened their own fire. Thin columns of smoke slowly rose above scattered rooftops. each one marking another household beginning another ordinary day. The well stood only a short walk from the house. Its wooden roof protected the water from leaves and rain, while the sturdy windlass made lifting heavy buckets much easier. Thomas lowered the rope until he heard the familiar splash. The water below remained cold throughout every season, clear, fresh, reliable. Colonial wells required regular care. Families often cleaned them carefully to prevent contamination, understanding through experience that clean water helped keep everyone healthy, even if they did not yet understand the science behind disease. Returning to the house, Thomas placed the buckets beside the kitchen table. Mary was already setting out wooden bowls. Each bowl had been carved by hand years earlier. No two looked exactly alike. One carried a darker grain. Another had a tiny knot near its rim. Small imperfections gave handmade objects their own quiet character. Breakfast began with a brief moment of gratitude. Then the family ate together. There was little conversation, not because anyone was unhappy, simply because the day ahead required thought and energy. After the meal, everyone immediately began clearing the table. Dishes were washed in warm water heated over the fire. Nothing remained sitting in the sink. Nothing waited until later. Colonial life rewarded people who finished small tasks before they became large ones. As the sun climbed higher above the trees, its golden light spilled across the farmhouse and surrounding fields. The long night had ended peacefully. The careful preparations made during the hour before darkness had carried the family safely through another autumn evening. Now a new day had begun. Soon the fields would once again echo with the steady rhythm of work. Axes would strike seasoned wood. Horses would pull wagons along narrow dirt roads. Smoke would rise from distant chimneys. And as the hours slowly passed, the Carter family, like thousands of other ordinary families across colonial America, would quietly begin preparing for another sunset, another evening, and another precious hour before darkness returned. The morning unfolded with the same quiet certainty that had guided countless mornings before it. As the sun climbed above the eastern hills, a golden light spilled across the fields, warming the frost-covered earth little by little. Tiny droplets of water formed where ice had rested only moments earlier. Spider webs stretched between fence rails shimmered like delicate lace, each thread decorated with sparkling beads of dew. Thomas stood beside the barn for a moment, watching the sunlight slowly reach the roof. He never considered this a waste of time. For generations, farmers had learned that the first few minutes of daylight revealed much about the day ahead. The color of the sunrise, the direction of the breeze, the moisture resting upon the grass, and even the behavior of birds offered valuable clues about changing weather. This morning appeared calm. The wind came gently from the northwest. The sky remained perfectly clear. There would be no rain today. Satisfied, Thomas opened the heavy barn doors. The familiar scent of clean hay, leather harnesses, fresh straw, and livestock drifted into the cool morning air. His old bay horse lifted its head immediately, recognizing the sound of footsteps. The milk cow waited patiently in her stall, already expecting the morning routine that had changed very little throughout her life. Samuel entered carrying a wooden stool and a polished bucket. Milking required patience rather than strength. The first streams of warm milk struck the bottom of the bucket with a steady rhythm that echoed softly through the barn. Tap, tap, tap. Within minutes the bucket slowly filled. Fresh milk was one of the most valuable foods available to colonial families. It became butter, soft cheese, cream, and buttermilk. During seasons when meat was scarce, dairy products often provided an important source of nourishment. Nearby, Elizabeth scattered grain across the chicken yard. The hens hurried toward her with surprising speed. Their quiet clucking filled the crisp morning air while a proud rooster watched carefully from the top of a wooden fence post. Before long, Mary began gathering eggs. She carried a woven basket lined with soft cloth to prevent them from cracking. Each egg would be used carefully. Some would become tomorrow's breakfast. Others might be traded with neighbors. A few would eventually hatch into chicks, ensuring the flock continued growing year after year. Nothing on the farm existed by accident. Every plant, every tool, every animal Every daily task formed part of a larger rhythm that kept the household alive. Beyond the farmyard, the surrounding forest glowed beneath brilliant autumn colors. Towering sugar maples displayed bright shades of orange and scarlet. Beech trees shimmered in soft golden brown. Dark green pines stood proudly among them, unchanged by the season. In the early 18th century, much of eastern North America remained covered by immense forests unlike anything most people experience today. Some trees had stood for centuries before the first European settlers arrived. Their massive trunks required several people joining hands to completely surround them. Travel through such forests demanded both courage and experience. Footpaths often followed old Native American trails that had connected rivers, hunting grounds, and villages long before colonial settlements appeared. Thomas respected those ancient paths. He knew they represented generations of knowledge about the land. Many early settlers survived only because indigenous peoples shared practical skills: how to grow unfamiliar crops, identify useful plants, travel safely through dense forests, and prepare for harsh winters. Without that knowledge, life on the frontier would have been far more difficult. As the morning continued, Thomas and Samuel repaired a section of split-rail fence damaged by a fallen tree branch several days earlier. Fence building was an endless task. Wood naturally aged, storms loosened rails, winter frost shifted fence posts. Each repair protected both crops and livestock. Working side by side, father and son spoke only occasionally. Silence never felt uncomfortable. Instead, it allowed them to hear the pleasant sounds surrounding them: the distant tapping of a woodpecker, the rustling of squirrels among fallen leaves, the steady creak of leather harnesses, the soft breeze moving through dry corn stalks left at the edge of the field. Every sound belonged exactly where it should. Near the garden, Elizabeth harvested the last remaining herbs before colder weather arrived. Bundles of rosemary, sage, thyme, mint, and lavender were tied together with simple linen cord before being hung beneath the farmhouse porch roof to finish drying. Herbs served many purposes in colonial homes. They flavored meals, freshened rooms, seasoned preserved meat, prepared teas, and, according to the understanding of the time, they often brought comfort during illness. Many household remedies combined generations of practical observation with traditional beliefs carried across the Atlantic from Europe. Although modern medicine has advanced tremendously since then, historians recognize that colonial families possessed remarkable knowledge of local plants and seasonal cycles. Little Hannah wandered carefully through the orchard carrying a small wooden basket. Every so often she discovered another apple hidden beneath fallen leaves. Some were too bruised for eating fresh. Those would become cider. Others remained perfectly firm. They would rest inside the cool cellar beneath layers of straw, lasting well into winter if stored properly. Preserving food required almost constant attention. A single spoiled apple could quickly damage those surrounding it. Careful inspection saved valuable harvests. By late morning, gentle warmth had replaced the early chill. Thin curls of smoke rose steadily from the farmhouse chimney, while sunlight illuminated every corner of the little homestead. Looking across the landscape, one might have believed life here was simple. In many ways it was. Yet beneath that simplicity rested extraordinary preparation, discipline, and quiet wisdom. Every peaceful morning depended upon yesterday's careful work. Every comfortable evening depended upon today's steady effort. And as the hours passed almost unnoticed, the Carter family continued their familiar routines, knowing that before the sun slipped below the western trees once again, another precious hour before darkness would return, bringing with it the same timeless ritual that had protected frontier families for generations. By midday, the warmth of the autumn sun had gently settled across the farm. The morning frost had disappeared completely, leaving the fields bright beneath a cloudless blue sky. A light breeze carried the scent of drying leaves across the valley, while scattered flocks of geese flew high overhead in graceful V-shaped formations, slowly making their long journey south for the winter. Thomas paused for a moment to watch them. Every autumn they returned to the sky, Every spring they came back again. Their steady migrations reminded people that nature followed its own dependable calendar, long before human beings began measuring time. Nearby, Samuel continued gathering split firewood into neat stacks beside the woodshed. The pile already stood taller than either of them, yet Thomas believed there was never such a thing as too much firewood. Experience had taught him that the coldest winters always seemed to arrive without warning. Throughout colonial America, families often began preparing next winter's firewood before the current winter had even ended. It was one task that could never truly be finished. Each log represented future warmth, future meals, future comfort, future survival. Mary carried freshly washed clothing toward a long rope stretched between two sturdy maple trees. Wooden clothespins did not yet exist in every household, so she secured each piece carefully with small strips of cloth tied into simple knots. The gentle breeze slowly lifted the linen shirts, wool stockings, aprons, and towels until they fluttered softly beneath the bright afternoon sun. Fresh air served as nature's dryer. Sunlight itself helped keep fabrics clean and fresh. Nothing happened quickly. Everything required patience. Elizabeth knelt beside the kitchen garden. Although most vegetables had already been harvested, a few late cabbages still rested beneath their broad green leaves. Carefully cutting each one with a small knife, she placed them inside a woven basket. Cabbage was remarkably valuable during the colonial period. It stored well through much of the winter. Some families transformed it into sauerkraut, a traditional method brought from Europe that helped preserve food while providing important nutrients during long months when fresh vegetables became scarce. Nearby, rows of carrots, parsnips, and turnips had already been lifted from the ground and stored safely in the root cellar. A well-built root cellar was one of the greatest treasures a family could possess. Built partially underground, these cool rooms maintained nearly constant temperatures throughout the year. Potatoes, apples, carrots, beets, onions, squash, even barrels of salted meat, all rested safely inside until needed. Without electricity, refrigeration depended entirely upon understanding the natural world. The Carter family's cellar remained cool because the earth itself protected it. Nature provided the technology. People simply learned how to use it wisely. While Elizabeth worked in the garden, little Hannah wandered slowly along the split-rail fence collecting colorful autumn leaves. Bright crimson maple leaves, golden beech leaves, rust-colored oak leaves. She arranged them carefully inside her small basket as though they were priceless treasures. Perhaps they were. Children in the 18th century often found joy in simple things that modern families sometimes overlook. A smooth stone, a feather, an interesting leaf, a pine cone. The changing seasons offered endless wonder. There was no need for expensive toys when the world itself provided so much to explore. Far beyond the fields, the forest shimmered beneath gentle sunlight. Sunbeams filtered through thousands of branches, creating shifting patterns of light across the woodland floor. Squirrels hurried from tree to tree carrying acorns. Chipmunks disappeared into hidden burrows with cheeks full of seeds. Somewhere nearby, a pulletud woodpecker hammered rhythmically against the trunk of a towering dead pine. The sound echoed across the valley. Tap, tap, tap. Its powerful beak searched beneath the bark for insects hiding inside the wood. Early settlers often welcomed woodpeckers. Healthy forests depended upon them. By removing insects from weakened trees, they quietly helped maintain the balance of the woodland. Thomas understood these things through years of careful observation. He believed every creature had its place, even those people rarely noticed. As the afternoon continued, he walked toward the edge of the property where several young apple trees had been planted only a few years earlier. Their trunks were still slender. Each one had been protected by simple wooden guards to prevent rabbits from chewing the bark during winter. Fruit trees required remarkable patience. Sometimes 5 or 6 years passed before they produced dependable harvests. But once mature, they could feed several generations. Planting a tree was an investment in the future. Many colonial farmers knew they might never enjoy its greatest harvest themselves. Still, they planted it anyway, not for today, for tomorrow, for their children. For grandchildren they might never meet. That quiet kind of hope shaped much of frontier life. Back at the farmhouse, the aroma of fresh bread drifted gently from the chimney. Elizabeth had mixed another batch of dough before sunrise, allowing it to rise slowly throughout the morning. Now the loaves baked inside the brick oven beside the fireplace, filling the house with one of the most comforting scents imaginable. Bread accompanied nearly every meal: cornmeal bread, rye bread, wheat bread whenever harvests allowed. Fresh butter spread across warm slices remained one of life's simplest pleasures. As the shadows slowly began stretching across the fields once again, Thomas noticed the familiar change in the sunlight. The brilliant white of midday softened into warm shades of gold. The breeze became cooler. Birdsong gradually quieted. Another day had almost reached its gentle conclusion. Without needing a clock, every member of the Carter family sensed what was coming next. Soon the final hour before darkness would begin once more. The evening routine, practiced hundreds of times before, would quietly return. The animals would be gathered, water would be drawn, candles prepared, firewood carried indoors. The hearth would glow warmly against the cooling air. And once again, inside one humble farmhouse surrounded by the vast American wilderness, ordinary people would demonstrate the timeless wisdom that allowed countless colonial families to greet each sunset not with fear, but with calm preparation, quiet gratitude, and peaceful confidence. The afternoon slowly surrendered to evening, almost so gently that no one noticed the exact moment when daylight began to fade. The bright blue sky softened into pale gold, and long shadows stretched across the fields once more. The familiar rhythm of the farm shifted almost without a word, as every member of the Carter family quietly turned toward the tasks that always came before sunset. There was comfort in repetition. The same routine had been followed yesterday. It would be followed tomorrow. And if fortune smiled upon them, it would continue for many years to come. Thomas leaned his axe against the chopping block and wiped a light layer of sweat from his forehead with the sleeve of his linen shirt. The day's work had been productive. Another stack of firewood stood neatly beside the woodshed, and the repaired fence looked strong enough to withstand the coming winter storms. He looked toward the western sky. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the distant hills. No words were necessary. The family already understood. It was time. Samuel carried 2 empty buckets toward the well. The familiar creak of the wooden windlass echoed softly through the quiet afternoon as the bucket disappeared into the cool darkness below. Moments later, fresh water shimmered in the fading sunlight as he lifted it back to the surface. Water collected before sunset always tasted especially cold. It had rested deep beneath the earth, protected from both summer heat and winter frost. Carrying the heavy buckets carefully, Samuel returned to the house without spilling more than a few drops along the path. Meanwhile, Mary gathered the freshly dried clothing from the line between the maple trees. The afternoon breeze had left every piece crisp and clean. She folded each shirt, apron, stocking, and towel with practiced care. Colonial families valued clean clothing not only for comfort, but also because well-maintained garments lasted much longer. Replacing fabric required enormous effort. Taking good care of it simply made sense. Nearby, Elizabeth entered the pantry carrying several freshly harvested cabbages. She carefully arranged them beside baskets of onions and turnips, making certain that each vegetable remained dry and well-spaced. Good storage required constant attention. One spoiled vegetable could quickly affect many others. Experienced homemakers inspected their food supplies almost daily, removing anything beginning to soften before it threatened the rest of the harvest. It was quiet work, patient work, the kind of work rarely celebrated in history books, yet absolutely essential for survival. Outside, little Hannah scattered handfuls of cracked corn across the chicken yard. The hens hurried toward her cheerful laughter, pecking eagerly at the grain before slowly making their way back toward the coop. The rooster paused for a moment upon the fence, lifting his head proudly as though inspecting the entire farm before finally following the rest of the flock. Animals often sensed the approach of evening before people did. Their routines rarely changed. Nature kept remarkably accurate time. Far above the farmhouse, several broad-winged hawks circled upon rising currents of warm air. Soon even they disappeared toward distant woods where they would spend the night perched high among the branches. As the birds settled, the sounds of the countryside gradually changed once again. The energetic songs of the morning gave way to softer evening calls. Crickets slowly awakened beneath the tall grass. Tree frogs began their gentle chorus near the creek. The breeze whispered through drying corn stalks left standing at the edge of the field. Nothing felt hurried. Everything seemed perfectly arranged by the turning of the seasons. Thomas walked toward the orchard carrying a small woven basket. Although most apples had already been harvested, a careful farmer always made one final inspection before darkness. Occasionally, a perfectly good apple remained hidden beneath the leaves. Sometimes a broken branch needed trimming before winter snow arrived. As he moved quietly between the trees, he noticed several deer tracks pressed into the soft earth. They had visited during the previous night. He smiled. The harvest had been good enough to share a little with the wildlife. Many frontier families accepted that complete control over nature was impossible. The land belonged not only to people, but also to the countless creatures living alongside them. Near the edge of the orchard stood an enormous white oak. Its trunk was so wide that even Thomas could not reach halfway around it with outstretched arms. The tree had likely begun growing centuries before his grandparents were born, perhaps long before any European ship crossed the Atlantic. Its branches had witnessed changing seasons for generations beyond counting. Standing beneath it always reminded Thomas that his own lifetime formed only a very small chapter in the story of the land. Back inside the farmhouse, Elizabeth prepared the evening meal. The iron pot hanging above the hearth slowly filled with the comforting aroma of vegetable stew, fresh cabbage, carrots, onions, a few pieces of salted pork, several fragrant herbs gathered from the garden. The ingredients were simple. The meal would be nourishing. In colonial homes, supper often arrived before complete darkness. Families preferred finishing most cooking while daylight still entered through the windows, saving precious candles for later in the evening. As the stew simmered gently, Mary kneaded another loaf of bread upon the smooth wooden table. Her hands moved almost automatically. Press, fold, turn, repeat. Skills like baking became second nature after years of daily practice. Recipes were seldom written. Knowledge passed directly from one pair of hands to another, mother to daughter, father to son, neighbor to neighbor, generation after generation. Outside, the western sky now glowed with brilliant shades of amber, crimson, and soft violet. The first cool breath of evening drifted across the fields. Thomas took one final look across the farm. The barn stood ready. The fences remained secure. The woodpile had grown larger. The garden rested peacefully. Smoke curled gently from the stone chimney into the calm autumn air. Another ordinary day had been well spent. Soon the last sunlight would slip beneath the hills. The precious hour before darkness had quietly arrived again, bringing with it the familiar sense of calm purpose that had guided colonial families through countless evenings across the American frontier, where preparation was not merely a habit, but one of the greatest forms of wisdom a household could possess. The familiar evening routine began without anyone announcing it. There was no bell to ring, no clock to signal the hour. The land itself quietly gave the reminder. The sunlight softened. The air cooled. The birds settled into the trees. Every sign whispered the same message. Night was approaching. Thomas lifted the heavy wooden bar across the barn doors after leading the horse inside. The old bay horse shook its mane gently before lowering its head toward a fresh bundle of hay. Nearby, the milk cow had already settled comfortably into her stall, while the sheep gathered close together in one corner, their thick wool preparing them for another chilly night. Samuel walked slowly from stall to stall carrying a small oil lantern. Its gentle flame cast warm circles of light across the wooden walls. He checked every latch, every bucket, every feeding trough. Nothing had been forgotten. Small habits often prevented large problems. A loose gate could allow animals to wander. An empty water bucket might weaken livestock before morning. Experience had taught frontier families that careful attention to ordinary details was one of the greatest forms of preparation. Outside, the orchard rested beneath the fatting sunlight. The leaves glowed like polished copper. A single apple loosened by the afternoon breeze fell quietly onto the grass below. No one heard it. Nature continued its endless work without asking for attention. Beyond the orchard, the creek reflected the colors of the sky so perfectly that the water seemed almost made of liquid gold. Small fish still moved beneath the surface, creating gentle circles that slowly disappeared into the calm current. The same creek had supplied drinking water, fish, smooth stones, and cool relief during summer heat for many years. Like the old oak tree standing nearby, it asked for nothing. It simply continued flowing. Elizabeth carefully stirred the evening stew with a long wooden spoon polished smooth by decades of use. The rich aroma of onions, herbs, fresh cabbage, carrots, and salted pork filled every corner of the farmhouse. Cooking over an open hearth demanded constant attention. There were no temperature controls, no timers. The cook judged the meal by experience alone, the color of the fire, the smell rising from the pot, the gentle bubbling of the broth. These small observations guided every successful meal. Mary sliced fresh bread that had cooled upon the windowsill throughout the afternoon. The crust cracked softly beneath the knife. Warm steam still lingered inside each loaf. Fresh bread rarely lasted long. Whatever remained after supper would become breakfast or accompany the next day's midday meal. Food never remained idle. Everything found its purpose. Little Hannah carefully placed wooden bowls around the table. She counted them quietly. One for Father, one for Mother, one for Mary, one for Samuel, one for herself. Then she placed 5 simple wooden spoons beside them. Even small responsibilities helped children feel useful within the household. As twilight slowly deepened, Thomas stepped onto the porch carrying only his hat. For several quiet moments, he simply stood. He watched the fields changing color beneath the lowering sun. The tall grasses no longer appeared bright green. Instead, they shimmered with soft bronze and amber. The forest beyond seemed darker now, its towering trees blending together into one peaceful wall of shadow. A flock of wild turkeys crossed the distant meadow before disappearing beneath the shelter of ancient oaks. Several crows called to one another as they searched for safe branches where they would spend the night. Everything moved according to an ancient rhythm. Nothing hurried, nothing delayed. The same patterns had unfolded season after season long before the farmhouse existed. They would continue long after it was gone. Thomas often found comfort in that thought. History was not only made by famous battles or important leaders. It was also written quietly by ordinary evenings like this one. Millions of families across colonial America ended their days in almost exactly the same way. They gathered livestock, prepared supper, stacked firewood, checked the weather, shared simple meals, looked toward tomorrow with hope. These quiet routines built communities one household at a time. As the first evening star appeared above the western horizon, Elizabeth called everyone inside. The family gathered around the sturdy oak table. For a brief moment, no one reached for their food. Instead, they paused together in grateful silence. Then supper began. Conversation remained gentle. Thomas spoke about repairing another section of fence before winter. Mary mentioned that the dried herbs would soon be ready for storage. Samuel described seeing fresh deer tracks near the orchard. Little Hannah proudly announced that she had collected 12 colorful leaves, each more beautiful than the last. No story felt too small. No observation seemed unimportant. Life moved slowly enough that even ordinary moments deserved attention. Outside, darkness quietly settled across the valley. The final streaks of orange faded from the sky. The stars returned one by one. A cool wind drifted across the fields, carrying the pleasant scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke from neighboring farms. Inside the farmhouse, the fire glowed warmly beneath the iron kettle. Its light danced gently across the log walls, filling the room with peaceful shadows. The thick wooden beams overhead, the sturdy stone chimney, the handmade furniture, and the comforting warmth of the hearth all reflected the quiet strength of a home built with patience, care, and determination. Another day on the colonial frontier had reached its gentle conclusion. Beyond the windows, the vast American wilderness stretched silently beneath an endless canopy of stars. But within those simple wooden walls, surrounded by family, warmth, and familiar routines. The Carter home stood as a small island of peace, a reminder that sometimes the greatest stories in history are not those filled with conflict, but those that reveal how ordinary people quietly endured, one sunset at a time. After supper, no one hurried away from the table. The wooden bowls were nearly empty, save for a few crumbs of bread and the last spoonful of broth. Elizabeth gathered everything carefully. Even the smallest scraps would not be wasted. The bread crumbs would feed the chickens in the morning, and the remaining broth would enrich tomorrow's stew. On a colonial farm, waste was not simply discouraged. It was almost unthinkable. Mary carried the bowls to a wooden wash basin near the fireplace. Hot water from the iron kettle was poured into the basin, followed by a little cool water from the well. There was no soap made in a factory waiting beneath the sink. Instead, Elizabeth used homemade lye soap, produced from wood ash and rendered animal fat. The bars looked plain, smelled faintly of wood smoke, and cleaned remarkably well. Making soap was an important household skill. Most families prepared enough during the autumn to last through the coming year. Without it, washing clothes, cleaning dishes, and maintaining good hygiene became far more difficult. Samuel stepped outside carrying a small basket. He scattered the last vegetable peelings near the pig pen. The pigs greeted him with cheerful grunts before eagerly finishing every piece. Nothing disappeared on a working farm. Nature quietly recycled everything. Vegetable scraps fed livestock. Animal manure enriched gardens. Ash from the fireplace helped make soap or improved soil in certain parts of the garden. The entire farm functioned as one carefully balanced system. Thomas smiled whenever he thought about it. People often believed they managed the land. In truth, they worked alongside it. The moon had risen higher now, casting a gentle silver light across the fields. The cool air carried almost no sound except the distant murmur of the creek and the occasional chirp of crickets hidden among the tall grass. Standing on the porch, Thomas looked toward the horizon where darkness had completely settled over the forest. Few people willingly traveled country roads after nightfall. Without lanterns, familiar paths quickly disappeared. Even with lanterns, deep wagon ruts, fallen branches, and muddy ground could make travel slow and dangerous. Most neighbors planned their visits carefully, arriving well before sunset and returning home while daylight still remained. Colonial evenings belonged to the family. Inside the farmhouse, Elizabeth opened a small wooden chest resting beneath the window. Folded neatly inside were blankets, carefully mended clothing, and several treasured keepsakes brought across the Atlantic years earlier. Among them rested a small silver spoon that had belonged to Thomas's mother, a tiny embroidered handkerchief, a worn leather journal filled with family notes. These simple belongings carried enormous emotional value. When families crossed the ocean to begin new lives in America, there was little room aboard crowded ships. Only the most meaningful possessions made the journey. Everything inside that chest represented memory, history, home. Mary finished washing the bowls and placed them upside down upon a clean cloth to dry. Without modern cabinets, dishes often rested on open wooden shelves where fresh air could circulate freely. The warmth from the nearby fireplace helped everything dry naturally. Little Hannah sat beside the hearth with her rag doll resting quietly in her lap. Elizabeth began humming a gentle tune passed down through generations of her family. The melody had crossed the Atlantic long before Hannah was born. Many colonial songs carried no known composer. They simply lived within families, traveling from one generation to the next through memory alone. Outside, an eastern screech owl called softly from the edge of the orchard. Its haunting but gentle whistle echoed through the cool night air. Thomas recognized the sound immediately. He had heard it almost every autumn since building the farmhouse. To strangers, such calls might have seemed mysterious. To those who lived here, they were reassuring. The forest sounded exactly as it should. Everything remained in balance. Samuel carefully checked the fireplace one final time before bed. He added only one small split log. Too much wood would overheat the room and waste fuel. Too little might allow the fire to fade completely before morning. Managing a hearth was almost an art. Families developed an instinct for exactly how much wood each night required. depending upon the weather, the season, and the strength of the wind outside. The old grandfather clock quietly marked another passing hour. Its deep chime rolled gently through the house. No one counted the strokes. There was no need. Morning would come when it always did. Thomas reached for a thick wool blanket woven several winters earlier. Its edges had been repaired many times, yet it remained warm and dependable. Like nearly everything else in the farmhouse, it had earned its place through years of faithful service. Before extinguishing the final candle, Elizabeth looked once around the room. The iron kettle rested safely near the hearth. The pantry door stood closed. The shutters remained fastened. Fresh water waited beside the fireplace. Firewood stood neatly stacked within easy reach. Every task had been completed. Every responsibility fulfilled. There was a quiet satisfaction in ending the day this way, not because life had been easy, but because careful preparation transformed uncertainty into confidence. The candle flame flickered gently one last time. Elizabeth leaned forward and softly pinched the wick between a small brass snuffer. Darkness immediately embraced the room. Only the glowing embers remained, painting the ceiling with a faint orange light. Outside, the moon continued its slow journey across the vast American sky. The stars watched silently over forests, rivers, distant settlements, and lonely farmhouses scattered across the colonies. Within one of those homes, the Carter family rested peacefully, surrounded by the quiet rewards of honest work, thoughtful preparation, and the timeless comfort of knowing that another ordinary day, one almost forgotten by history, had been lived well from sunrise to darkness. The farmhouse slept peacefully, wrapped in the quiet embrace of the late autumn night. Outside, the fields shimmered beneath a blanket of pale moonlight. Every blade of grass carried a thin layer of frost that sparkled whenever a faint breeze shifted across the meadow. The split-rail fence stretched through the landscape like a dark ribbon, disappearing into the shadows near the forest's edge. The wilderness seemed silent, yet it was filled with life. A family of white-tailed deer stepped carefully from the protection of the trees, their ears constantly turning toward the smallest sound. They moved slowly into the harvested cornfield, searching for the few scattered kernels left behind after the autumn harvest. Their movements were graceful, almost weightless, leaving only faint tracks upon the frosted ground. High above them, the stars continued their patient journey across the heavens. People living in colonial America often knew the night sky almost as well as they knew their own farms. Farmers recognized the changing position of constellations as the seasons advanced. Sailors crossed entire oceans by following the stars. Travelers moving between settlements frequently depended upon the North Star to maintain their direction when roads disappeared beneath snow or darkness. The sky served as both calendar and compass. Inside the farmhouse, the warmth from the fireplace lingered pleasantly. The thick log walls held the heat remarkably well, while the heavy stone chimney slowly released the warmth it had absorbed throughout the evening. Long before insulated walls or central heating existed, builders understood how natural materials could create comfortable homes. Thomas shifted quietly beneath his blanket. Years of farm work had trained him to wake briefly whenever unfamiliar sounds drifted through the night. He listened. The wind, the quiet breathing of his family, the soft settling of old timber as the house adjusted to the cooling air. Everything sounded exactly as it should. Satisfied, he closed his eyes once more. The house itself had a gentle voice. Every old farmhouse developed one over time. A floorboard might creak softly. A roof beam could release a faint sigh. The chimney stones occasionally produced tiny clicking sounds as they slowly cooled after a long day beside the fire. To visitors, such noises might have seemed mysterious. To the Carter family, they were comforting. They meant the house was simply growing older alongside them. Near the hearth, the iron kettle still held warm water prepared before bedtime. Morning would come more easily because someone had remembered that simple task. Much of colonial life depended upon thinking several hours ahead, often several months ahead. Families planted crops long before hunger arrived. They cut firewood while the weather remained warm. They preserved food before winter appeared. They repaired roofs before storms began. Preparation quietly shaped every season. Outside, a gentle mist gathered once again above the creek. The water remained slightly warmer than the surrounding air, allowing delicate ribbons of fog to drift across the low meadow. The moonlight transformed the mist into silver clouds that floated silently between the trees. It was a beautiful sight. Few people witnessed it. Most families slept soundly, trusting the night to pass as peacefully as countless nights before. Inside the barn, the horse shifted comfortably upon its bed of straw before settling again. The sheep remained huddled together, sharing warmth beneath their thick fleece. The milk cow breathed slowly, her steady rhythm filling the quiet building with peaceful life. Animals followed ancient routines. They asked for little beyond food, shelter, water, and gentle care. In return, they became trusted companions in the daily work of the farm. Thomas often believed the animals understood the seasons even better than people did. They sensed approaching weather. They recognized changing daylight. They prepared naturally for winter without needing calendars. Just beyond the orchard, an old stone boundary marker rested beneath layers of moss. It had been placed there many years earlier by one of the first surveyors to measure the land. During the early 18th century, surveying the American colonies remained challenging work. Dense forests, winding rivers, steep hills, and primitive tools meant that property lines often depended upon natural landmarks rather than exact measurements. A large oak tree, a creek, a massive boulder, these became trusted boundaries for generations. Many of those same markers remained standing for decades. Back inside the farmhouse, the old grandfather clock continued its faithful work. Its pendulum swung with quiet certainty. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Time moved steadily forward. It always had. It always would. Yet within these peaceful hours, it seemed almost unwilling to hurry. The Carter family had no appointments waiting, no crowded schedules, no endless stream of interruptions. Their lives followed the slower rhythm of sunrise, weather, harvests, and seasons. There was wisdom hidden within that pace. Modern life often encourages people to move faster. Colonial life gently encouraged them to notice more. The changing colors of leaves, the sound of rain upon the roof, the smell of fresh bread, the warmth of a well-tended fire, the brilliance of stars untouched by city lights. These ordinary experiences quietly filled each day with meaning. As midnight gradually gave way to the earliest hours before dawn, the temperature continued falling. Thin ice began forming along the shallow edges of the creek. The breeze became almost perfectly still. The entire valley rested beneath a silence so complete that even a single falling leaf could have been heard drifting through the darkness. Within the safety of the farmhouse, surrounded by thick blankets, glowing embers, and familiar walls built with patient hands, the Carter family remained peacefully asleep. Tomorrow would bring another sunrise, another day's honest work, another evening of careful preparation. And once again, as the sun slowly approached the western hills, they would enter that timeless hour before darkness, the quiet hour that had shaped the lives of ordinary colonial families across America for generations, teaching them that true security was rarely found in wealth, but in patience, preparation, and the comforting rhythm of everyday life. Before the first rooster announced the morning, the world belonged to silence. The moon had begun its slow descent toward the western horizon, while the eastern sky remained dark enough for the brightest stars to continue shining. A faint ribbon of mist drifted across the meadow, wrapping itself around old fence posts and low stone walls before dissolving into the cold autumn air. Inside the farmhouse, the embers beneath the hearth still glowed quietly. Thomas awoke before anyone else, just as he did nearly every morning. There was no alarm clock, no bell, no hurried rush. Years of living with the rhythm of the land had become his clock. He pulled a wool coat over his shoulders and quietly crossed the wooden floor. The familiar boards creaked softly beneath his boots, sounds he knew so well that he could almost tell exactly where he stood without looking. Kneeling before the fireplace, he brushed aside the thin blanket of gray ash covering the coals. A warm orange glow appeared immediately. He smiled. The fire had survived another night. Taking a small bundle of dried pine needles, cedar bark, and slender twigs stored beside the hearth, he arranged them gently over the glowing embers. With only a few careful breaths, A thin stream of smoke curled upward. Then came the first tiny flame. Soon another followed. Within minutes, the fireplace was alive once more, filling the room with a gentle warmth that slowly chased away the coolness of the night. For centuries, this simple ritual welcomed each new day across countless colonial homes. It was never dramatic, yet it was one of the most important moments every morning. Without fire, breakfast could not be prepared, water could not be warmed. The house remained cold. Fire truly was the heart of the home. Thomas placed the iron kettle above the growing flames and stepped quietly outside. The air felt wonderfully crisp. His breath drifted before him in pale white clouds. Across the valley, the first hint of dawn finally touched the horizon, painting the distant hills with delicate shades of blue and silver. Everything else remained perfectly still. No wagon wheels rolled along the dirt road. No voices carried across the fields. Only the gentle rustling of dry leaves accompanied the distant murmur of the creek. Standing there, Thomas could almost imagine that the entire continent still slept. In many ways, much of it did. During the early 18th century, the population of Britain's American colonies was only a small fraction of what it would become generations later. Vast forests stretched for hundreds of miles without interruption. Entire days of travel could pass without encountering another settlement. For frontier families, solitude was simply part of everyday life, yet it rarely felt lonely. Nature provided constant company. A red fox trotted quietly across the far edge of the pasture, pausing briefly to sniff the cold morning air before disappearing into the woods. Moments later, several wild turkeys emerged from beneath a cluster of oak trees, scratching gently among fallen leaves in search of acorns. Thomas watched them with quiet appreciation. Wildlife often revealed the health of the land. A forest rich with birds and animals usually meant healthy streams, fertile soil, and balanced seasons. Returning indoors, he found Elizabeth already awake. She smiled as the smell of fresh wood smoke filled the room. Without exchanging many words, they began another familiar morning together. She measured coarse cornmeal into a wooden bowl while Thomas poured fresh well water into the kettle. Simple routines required almost no conversation. Each person knew exactly what needed to be done. Soon the gentle aroma of porridge began filling the farmhouse. Mary joined them a few moments later, tying her apron before helping prepare the table. Samuel stepped outside to gather fresh eggs from the chicken coop before the morning became busy. The hens clucked softly as he reached beneath them. 1, 2, 3, 4. By the time he finished, 11 fresh eggs rested carefully inside his basket. Colonial families often considered eggs one of the most dependable foods available. Chickens required relatively little space. They produced food almost daily, and they helped control insects around the farm. Few animals offered so many benefits. Little Hannah finally wandered sleepily into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes while clutching her well-loved rag doll. Elizabeth laughed softly before placing a warm mug of fresh milk before her. Outside, the eastern sky brightened steadily. The first golden rays of sunlight touched the highest branches of the great white oak standing beside the orchard. Moments later, they reached the roof of the barn. Then the farmhouse windows began glowing warmly. Another day had officially begun. The valley slowly awakened. Bluebirds fluttered across the fence line. A woodpecker resumed its steady tapping somewhere within the forest. The horse greeted the morning with a gentle snort. The entire landscape seemed to stretch peacefully beneath the growing light. Thomas stood quietly on the porch holding a steaming wooden cup. He watched the sunrise without saying a word. Every morning felt both familiar and completely new. No two dawns ever painted the sky exactly the same way. Some arrived beneath brilliant crimson clouds. Others appeared through gentle morning fog. Today's sunrise glowed softly with pale gold, promising another calm autumn day. It reminded him of something his own father had once said many years earlier. "A man who watches enough sunrises," he had whispered, "will eventually understand that the land is always teaching those willing to pay attention." Thomas believed those words more with every passing year. The fields, the forest, the changing weather, the stars, the birds, even the quiet hour before darkness. Together they formed a classroom unlike any other. And with another peaceful morning now unfolding across the colonial countryside, the Carter family prepared once again to learn whatever gentle lessons this new day would quietly bring. As the morning sun climbed higher into the clear autumn sky, a gentle warmth settled over the valley. The cool mist that had drifted across the fields before sunrise slowly disappeared, revealing rows of harvested crops, weathered fences, and the winding creek that reflected the bright blue sky like polished glass. Thomas believed the hours just after sunrise were the most valuable of the day. The air remained cool enough for hard work. The animals were rested. The mind was clear. If important tasks were completed before midday, the remainder of the afternoon often unfolded with a welcome sense of calm. He reached for a broad-bladed hoe resting beside the woodshed and walked toward the vegetable garden. Although the main harvest had already ended, preparing the soil for next spring had already begun. This surprised many newcomers to colonial life. The growing season never truly ended. As soon as one harvest finished, preparations for the next quietly began. Thomas loosened the earth with slow, steady movements. Dry leaves were mixed into the soil. Ash from the fireplace was scattered over certain beds where it would gradually enrich the ground. Nearby, compost made from vegetable scraps, straw, and animal manure slowly transformed into dark, fertile earth. Nothing was wasted. Nature constantly recycled itself. Colonial farmers simply learned to work alongside that endless cycle. Not far away, Elizabeth opened the smokehouse standing behind the barn. The small wooden building carried the rich scent of oak smoke that had settled into its walls over many years. From sturdy beams hung several pieces of cured pork prepared earlier in the season. Smoking meat had become one of the most dependable methods of preservation. A slow fire burned beneath the food for many days, allowing cool smoke to remove moisture while protecting the meat from spoilage. Combined with salt, this process often kept food edible throughout the long winter months. Preserving enough food before cold weather arrived demanded careful planning. One successful harvest did not guarantee survival. Only careful storage did. Samuel led the horse toward a small pasture where the remaining grass still grew thick enough for grazing. The leather bridle showed signs of long use but remained strong because it had been cleaned and treated regularly with tallow. Well-maintained equipment often lasted for decades. Replacing tools on the frontier could require weeks of travel or months of waiting for a skilled craftsman. People repaired first, replaced only when absolutely necessary. Nearby, Mary sat beneath the wide branches of the old white oak with a sewing basket resting beside her. Sunlight filtered through the fatting leaves, creating shifting patches of light across the fabric in her lap. She carefully mended a wool coat that had served the family through several winters. A torn sleeve, a worn cuff, a loose seam. None of these meant the garment had reached the end of its usefulness. Strong stitches restored its strength. Colonial clothing often passed through several members of the same family before finally being transformed into quilts, cleaning cloths, or stuffing for handmade pillows. Every thread had value. Little Hannah wandered through the orchard collecting smooth stones from the narrow footpath. She examined each one carefully before placing it into her apron pocket. Some were perfectly round. Others displayed interesting colors or tiny sparkling crystals. To a child growing up on the frontier, the natural world offered endless treasures. Every walk became an adventure. Every season revealed something new. Beyond the orchard, the forest stood quietly beneath the gentle breeze. Sunlight poured through the branches, illuminating clouds of golden leaves drifting lazily toward the ground. The soft rustling created a peaceful melody unlike any instrument made by human hands. Autumn possessed its own music, the whisper of dry leaves, the distant tapping of woodpeckers, the chatter of squirrels gathering acorns, the quiet splash of fish breaking the surface of the creek. For families living here, these sounds became as familiar as the voices of neighbors. Around mid-morning, Thomas paused beside the fence and looked across the valley. Thin columns of smoke rose from several distant farmhouses. Although each family lived far apart, everyone followed remarkably similar routines. Someone would be chopping firewood, someone else baking bread, children would be gathering eggs. A blacksmith's hammer might already be ringing from a nearby village. Life moved independently yet together. The colonies were growing slowly. New farms appeared each year. Roads gradually improved. Small trading posts expanded into villages, yet the land remained overwhelmingly wild. Large forests still separated communities. Travel between settlements often required hours or even days. Neighbors learned to depend upon one another because help could never arrive quickly. Barn raisings, harvest gatherings, apple cider pressings. These became opportunities not only for work, but also for strengthening friendships that might one day save lives during difficult seasons. Elizabeth often said that kindness was as valuable as a full pantry. Thomas quietly agreed. As the morning stretched toward noon, the smell of fresh bread once again drifted from the farmhouse chimney. The familiar aroma mixed with cool autumn air, creating one of the most comforting scents imaginable. It spread across the yard, through the orchard, and even toward the nearby woods. For anyone traveling along the lonely dirt road, that simple fragrance would have spoken of warmth, safety, and welcome. The Carter farmhouse remained modest. Its walls were plain, its furniture simple, its possessions few. Yet within those sturdy oak beams lived something that could not be measured by wealth alone: patience, hard work, respect for the land, gratitude for ordinary days. These quiet qualities shaped countless families throughout colonial America. They rarely appeared in official records or history books. No monument was built to honor a carefully tended fire. No statue celebrated a loaf of homemade bread or a repaired fence. And yet, without these humble daily acts, the larger story of early America could never have been written. As the sun continued its slow climb toward midday, another peaceful chapter unfolded within the little farmhouse, where every ordinary task quietly became part of a much greater history, one built not by extraordinary moments, but by thousands of calm, thoughtful days lived in harmony with the land. By the time the sun stood high above the valley, the morning's cool air had given way to the gentle warmth of early afternoon. The farmhouse rested beneath a brilliant blue sky, its weathered oak walls glowing softly in the sunlight. The stone chimney released only a thin ribbon of smoke now, drifting lazily above the treetops before disappearing into the still autumn air. There was a peaceful confidence to this hour. The busiest work of the morning had been completed. The evening's preparations had not yet begun. For a little while, the farm seemed to breathe more slowly. Thomas walked toward the edge of the property, where a narrow path disappeared into the woods. He was not hunting today. Instead, he wished to inspect several maple trees that would provide sap when late winter eventually returned. Planning months ahead was simply part of life. Even while autumn leaves still covered the ground, experienced farmers quietly prepared for spring. The forest welcomed him with familiar sounds. A gentle breeze stirred the highest branches. Sunlight filtered through golden leaves, painting the woodland floor with shifting patches of light. A pair of gray squirrels chased one another around the trunk of a towering hickory before vanishing into the canopy above. Nearby, a pile of acorns lay scattered beneath an ancient oak. Some had fallen naturally. Others had been dropped by busy squirrels whose hurried work occasionally left small treasures behind. Colonial families often gathered nuts during autumn walks. Walnuts, chestnuts, and hickory nuts added valuable nourishment throughout the colder months. Children especially enjoyed helping with the harvest. Simple woven baskets soon became surprisingly heavy after only an hour beneath the trees. Thomas paused beside a fallen log covered with thick green moss. Tiny mushrooms pushed their way through the damp wood, quietly returning it to the soil. Even in decay, the forest wasted nothing. A tree that had once shaded travelers gradually became food for insects, birds, and countless invisible organisms beneath the earth. Eventually, it would nourish new saplings reaching toward the sky. Nature's patience stretched far beyond human lifetimes. Thomas admired that quiet lesson. Not far away, Elizabeth remained busy beside the farmhouse. She opened several clay crocks resting inside the cool pantry. One contained pickled cucumbers prepared during late summer. Another held preserved beans. A third contained apples stored beneath layers of clean straw. Each crock was carefully inspected. The lids were checked, the contents examined. Preserved food rewarded careful attention. A single unnoticed problem could spoil weeks of hard work. Fortunately, everything remained in excellent condition. Elizabeth smiled with quiet satisfaction. Winter would find the pantry well prepared. Samuel spent the afternoon repairing the wooden handle of a garden rake. The old handle had cracked after years of steady use. Instead of discarding the tool, he shaped a new hickory handle using only a draw-knife, a small plane and patient hands. Tool repair formed an important part of frontier life. Blacksmiths created iron heads, carpenters shaped wooden handles. Farmers themselves often completed smaller repairs. Every useful object received a second chance, sometimes a third, sometimes a fourth. Little Hannah sat upon the farmhouse porch with her basket of colorful leaves collected earlier in the week. She arranged them into neat rows according to shape and color. Bright scarlet maple leaves, golden birch, deep brown oak, soft yellow poplar to her. Each leaf seemed wonderfully unique. Elizabeth watched quietly from the doorway. She hoped Hannah would always notice small beauties like these. Life demanded hard work, but it also offered moments of quiet wonder for those willing to look closely. Across the valley, faint sounds drifted from a neighboring farm. The rhythmic ringing of a blacksmith's hammer echoed softly through the clear afternoon air. Clang, clang, clang. Iron met iron with steady precision. Every strike shaped horseshoes, hinges, nails, or farming tools that nearby families depended upon. In colonial America, the village blacksmith was among the most respected craftsmen. Without skilled metalworkers, wagons could not travel, plows could not cut fields, axes could not fell trees. Entire communities relied upon their knowledge. As the afternoon slowly unfolded, clouds began appearing along the western horizon. They were high, thin, and feather-like, drifting quietly across the blue sky. Thomas recognized them immediately when he returned from the woods. Such clouds often suggested that weather might change within a day or two. He made a mental note. Tomorrow, another load of firewood should be brought closer to the house. Preparation was easiest while the weather remained pleasant. Waiting until rain arrived rarely ended well. The old white oak beside the orchard released another gentle shower of leaves. They floated silently toward the ground, spinning gracefully before settling among the grass. No leaf hurried its journey. Each followed the breeze wherever it happened to lead. Watching them always seemed to slow the passing hours. By late afternoon, long shadows had begun stretching once again across the fields. The sunlight lost the brilliant white glow of midday and slowly transformed into rich shades of amber. The horse wandered back toward the barn. The chickens pecked their final grains before moving closer to the coop. Even the wild birds grew quieter. Nature understood that another evening approached. Inside the farmhouse, Elizabeth placed fresh bread upon the cooling rack near the open window. Its warm aroma drifted across the yard, mingling with the scent of dry leaves and distant pine. For a traveler passing along the lonely road, that fragrance would have carried an unmistakable message. A family lived here. The hearth was warm. The day had been honest. And before long, as the shadows continued growing longer across the quiet American countryside, another precious hour before darkness would begin, bringing with it the familiar rituals, gentle conversations, glowing firelight, and peaceful reflections that had comforted ordinary colonial families through countless autumn evenings beneath the endless sky. The golden afternoon slowly melted into the soft light of early evening. It happened so gradually that only the shadows truly revealed the passing of time. The great white oak beside the orchard cast an ever longer shadow across the pasture, reaching toward the split-rail fence that marked the edge of the Carter family's land. The warm sunlight that had brightened the farmhouse only an hour before now rested gently upon the western hills, painting them in rich shades of amber and copper. Thomas noticed the change immediately. After decades of living by the rhythm of the seasons, he no longer needed a clock to tell him when the day was ending. The land always spoke first. The breeze became cooler. The birds sang less frequently. The light softened. Every familiar sign quietly announced that another evening was drawing near. He laid aside the wooden mallet he had been using to repair a wagon wheel. The wagon itself stood beneath a simple shelter beside the barn. its sturdy oak frame showing years of faithful service. The iron rims around its wheels had been forged by the village blacksmith many seasons earlier, while the wooden spokes had been carved from seasoned hickory chosen for its remarkable strength. A dependable wagon represented far more than transportation. It carried harvests to market, brought supplies home from town, transported firewood from the forest, helped neighbors during barn raisings. In many ways, it became another trusted member of the household. Thomas gently tested the repaired wheel. It turned smoothly, another task completed before sunset. Nearby, Samuel gathered the family's tools one by one. The axe returned to its place beside the chopping block. The hoe was cleaned of soil before being stored inside the shed. The drawknife was lightly coated with animal fat to prevent rust during the damp autumn nights. Good tools rewarded good care. Many frontier families owned only a handful of iron implements. Replacing even one could require weeks of waiting and considerable expense. Looking after them was simply common sense. Elizabeth stepped into the herb garden for one final walk before the coming frost ended another growing season. Only a few hardy plants still remained: sage, rosemary, thyme. She gently touched each one, breathing in their familiar fragrance. For generations, these herbs had flavored meals, scented homes, and comforted families through long winters. Though modest in appearance, they represented months of careful tending beneath spring rains and summer sunshine. Nothing useful arrived without patience. Mary returned from the orchard carrying a basket of late apples. Their skins displayed beautiful shades of crimson, gold, and soft green. Some would be baked into pies, others sliced and dried above the hearth. Several would be pressed into sweet cider. Apples became one of the most versatile foods available to colonial families. Properly stored, they often lasted deep into winter, bringing a welcome taste of autumn long after snow covered the fields. Little Hannah skipped happily along the garden path, proudly carrying a handful of bright maple leaves she believed were the most beautiful she had ever found. Thomas smiled as he watched her. Children possessed a wonderful ability to notice simple beauty without needing a reason. A colorful leaf, a smooth stone, a feather drifting upon the breeze. These small discoveries often brought greater happiness than expensive possessions ever could. As the family completed their final outdoor tasks, the countryside itself seemed to settle into quiet anticipation. The flock of geese that had flown overhead earlier in the afternoon had long since disappeared beyond the southern horizon. Blue jays grew quieter among the branches. A pair of rabbits emerged cautiously from the edge of the woods to nibble clover in the fatting light. Even the creek appeared calmer, its gentle current reflecting the warm colors of the evening sky. Colonial families often believed that dusk was one of the most beautiful hours of the entire day. The hard work had been finished. The dangers of complete darkness had not yet arrived. For a brief time, everything seemed perfectly balanced between day and night. Thomas paused beside the old stone well. He lowered the wooden bucket one more time. The splash echoed faintly from the cool water below. Drawing enough fresh water before darkness became an evening habit throughout much of colonial America. Lantern light made trips to the well possible after sunset, but daylight made them easier and safer. Simple preparation always reduced unnecessary work later. Returning to the house, he noticed thin ribbons of smoke rising from several neighboring farms scattered across the distant valley. Though separated by forests and open fields, every household seemed connected by the same quiet evening rituals. Someone else was gathering chickens. Another family was lighting their hearth. Children somewhere beyond the hills were likely washing wooden bowls after supper. A blacksmith might be closing his workshop. Life moved separately, yet together. As the western sky deepened into brilliant shades of orange, rose, and violet, Elizabeth opened the farmhouse door. The comforting aroma of fresh bread and slow-cooked stew drifted into the cool evening air. It welcomed everyone home without a single word. Inside, the fire had already been coaxed into lively flames. The familiar crackling sound echoed softly against the sturdy log walls. Candles waited nearby but remained unlit. The last natural light entering through the windows still served the family well. Colonial households understood the value of every candle. Each one represented hours of careful work, rendering tallow or collecting precious beeswax. They were never burned carelessly. Thomas removed his hat and quietly looked around the room. Everything stood ready, fresh water beside the hearth, firewood stacked neatly, the pantry well supplied, the day's tools safely stored. Outside, the first evening star appeared above the darkening horizon, another peaceful hour before darkness had arrived. It was the same quiet hour that countless ordinary families across the American colonies had treasured for generations. A gentle pause between labor and rest, where the simple comforts of home felt richer than any fortune, and where history was written not with loud celebrations, but with warm firelight, grateful hearts, and the steady rhythm of another day lived well. The final glow of daylight slowly slipped beyond the western hills, leaving behind a sky painted with soft shades of lavender, deep blue, and fading gold. For a few quiet minutes, the entire countryside seemed suspended between two worlds. Day had not completely disappeared. Night had not fully arrived. This gentle transition was one of Thomas's favorite moments. He stood quietly on the farmhouse porch, resting one hand upon the smooth wooden railing polished by years of weather and use. Before him stretched the familiar landscape that had become home, a patchwork of harvested fields, winding fences, quiet orchards, and endless forests reaching toward the distant horizon. Everything appeared peaceful, yet every peaceful evening represented the result of careful preparation. Colonial families understood that comfort never arrived by accident. Warm fires existed because someone had gathered wood. Full pantries existed because someone had worked through spring, summer, and autumn. Safe homes existed because neighbors had raised walls together and maintained them year after year. Even quiet evenings had been earned. A cool breeze drifted through the valley, carrying with it the earthy fragrance of fallen leaves mixed with the sweet scent of drying hay stored inside the barn. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. He listened. The familiar sounds returned one after another. The distant hoot of a barred owl somewhere deep within the woods, the soft chirping of crickets hidden beneath the grass, the quiet rustle of leaves as a squirrel hurried toward its nest before darkness settled completely. Every sound belonged naturally within the evening. None disturbed the silence. Instead, they completed it. Inside the farmhouse, Elizabeth carefully arranged several beeswax candles upon the wooden table. Unlike ordinary tallow candles, beeswax burned with a cleaner flame and produced a gentle honey-like fragrance. They were more expensive and therefore used sparingly. Many colonial households saved beeswax candles for Sundays, holidays, or particularly important evenings. Tonight, however, only one small candle would be needed. The fireplace already provided most of the room's warm light. Samuel returned from the barn carrying one final armful of oak logs. He stacked them neatly beside the hearth. Thomas always insisted that enough firewood remain indoors for the entire night. If heavy rain or unexpected snow arrived before dawn, no one would need to step outside until morning. Preparation often meant imagining tomorrow's problems before they appeared. Mary opened the family Bible once again. Its leather binding had softened with age. Several pages bore careful handwritten notes recording births, marriages, and the passing of loved ones. For many colonial families, the family Bible served not only as a religious text, but also as the official record of family history. Long before government offices maintained detailed records, these treasured books quietly preserved generations of memories. Little Hannah climbed into her favorite rocking chair near the fireplace. She held her rag doll close while watching the dancing flames reflected across the iron kettle. The fire created endless shapes upon the walls: mountains, trees, ships, castles. At least, that was what Hannah imagined. Children have always possessed a wonderful gift for seeing stories hidden within ordinary things, outside. Darkness continued spreading across the valley. The last colors disappeared from the western sky. One by one, stars returned overhead. The familiar band of the Milky Way slowly emerged, stretching across the heavens with breathtaking clarity. People living in the 18th century often experienced skies almost impossible for modern eyes to imagine. Without electric lights, Thousands upon thousands of stars filled every corner of the night. Many believed they could almost reach upward and touch them. Thomas often paused before going to bed simply to admire that remarkable view. It reminded him that his own small farm formed only one tiny part of a much larger world. Across the Atlantic Ocean lay countries his grandparents had once called home. Far beyond the western forests stretched lands that few European settlers had yet explored. And above all of it, the same stars quietly watched generation after generation. History itself seemed to move beneath their patient light. Elizabeth gently stirred the glowing embers with the iron poker. Bright orange sparks briefly rose into the chimney before disappearing from sight. She added only 2 carefully chosen logs. Not too many, not too few. Enough warmth to last until dawn. Managing a fireplace required instinct developed through years of practice. Every evening offered slightly different conditions: cool winds, dry air, changing temperatures. The fire answered each one differently. Experience became the greatest teacher. The old grandfather clock quietly announced another passing hour. Its deep chime rolled through the farmhouse before fading once again into silence. No one hurried to finish the evening. There was no reason to. Tomorrow's work would arrive with the sunrise. Tonight belonged to peace. The family gathered together near the hearth. Conversation remained gentle. Thomas spoke of seeing fresh deer tracks near the maple grove. Elizabeth wondered whether the first snow might arrive within a few weeks. Samuel hoped to finish repairing the wagon before colder weather settled across the valley. Mary smiled as Hannah proudly displayed her collection of colorful autumn leaves. No one interrupted. No one rushed the conversation. Every small observation mattered. Perhaps that was one of the greatest lessons colonial life quietly taught. Ordinary moments deserved attention. Outside, the wilderness settled beneath a blanket of silver moonlight. The creek continued flowing toward distant rivers. The forest stood patiently beneath the stars. The old white oak watched over the farmhouse just as it had for centuries. Within the warm glow of the hearth, the Carter family prepared to welcome another peaceful night. And in that quiet little home, surrounded by careful craftsmanship, honest labor, and the timeless rhythm of the natural world, another page of history was written, not through famous events or grand discoveries, but through the gentle courage of ordinary people who found lasting happiness in simple routines, thoughtful preparation, and the comforting hour before darkness. The evening grew quieter with every passing minute. The single beeswax candle on the table burned with a calm, steady flame, while the fireplace filled the room with a warm amber glow that softened every corner of the farmhouse. Shadows stretched gently across the log walls, rising and falling with the movement of the fire as though the house itself were quietly breathing. Outside, the temperature continued to fall. A thin layer of frost had already begun forming upon the wooden fence rails nearest the meadow. The harvested fields reflected the moonlight with a pale silver shimmer, and the narrow creek wound silently through the valley like a ribbon of polished glass. Thomas sat comfortably beside the hearth, carefully sharpening a small pocket knife upon a smooth whetstone. The slow, steady sound of steel sliding across stone blended naturally with the crackling fire. Sharpening tools was never considered wasted time. A dull blade required more effort. It slipped more easily. It wore out faster. A sharp tool made work both safer and easier. Across colonial America, evenings often became the perfect opportunity for quiet maintenance. Harnesses were repaired, buttons were sewn, boots received fresh leather dressing, wooden handles were sanded smooth. These small acts rarely appeared in history books, yet they quietly supported every successful farm and household. Elizabeth unfolded a woven basket filled with wool that had been washed, dried, and carefully carded during previous weeks. With practiced hands, she began spinning fresh thread upon the old spinning wheel standing near the window. The wheel turned slowly, softly, almost musically. Its familiar humming sound had echoed through countless colonial homes for generations. Producing cloth demanded extraordinary patience. Before a shirt could be sewn, sheep first needed to grow wool. The wool required shearing, then washing, drying, carding, spinning, weaving. Only then could sewing finally begin. A single garment represented hundreds of hours of quiet labor. Knowing this, people cared for their clothing with remarkable respect. Mary continued mending one of Thomas's heavy winter coats. The elbows had worn thin after years of chopping wood and repairing fences. Instead of replacing the coat, she carefully stitched reinforced patches over the worn places using strong linen thread. A repaired coat often became stronger than a new one. Samuel sat nearby, carving a small wooden spoon from a block of maple. Thin curls of pale wood gathered at his feet, as each careful cut slowly revealed the graceful shape hidden inside the timber. Carving required patience more than strength. One hurried movement could ruin hours of careful work. Thomas often reminded him that good craftsmanship always rewarded those willing to slow down. Little Hannah rested quietly upon a braided rug near the fire. Her eyes followed the dancing flames while Elizabeth's spinning wheel hummed gently in the background. Without realizing it, she was learning, not through formal lessons, but through observation. Children absorbed knowledge simply by living beside experienced adults. They watched, listened, copied. One day, these familiar evening routines would become her own. Outside, the moon climbed higher above the valley. Its bright light illuminated the old white oak standing proudly beside the orchard. The enormous tree cast a long shadow across the frosted grass, just as it had through countless autumn nights before the Carter family ever built their farmhouse. How many generations had rested beneath its branches? How many storms had it survived? How many sunrises had it witnessed? No one could say. Some historians estimate that many great oaks standing during the colonial period had already been growing for 2 or even 3 centuries. They quietly connected one generation to another. The forest itself carried memories older than written records. Beyond the trees, the distant howl of a lone wolf drifted gently through the night. It was faint, almost peaceful. Contrary to many popular tales, wolves usually avoided settled farms whenever possible. Healthy forests provided plenty of natural prey. Their calls served more as communication with distant pack members than as threats to nearby families. Thomas listened for a moment before returning to his sharpening stone. The sound soon faded into the vast silence of the wilderness. The grandfather clock quietly marked another passing hour. Its pendulum never hurried, never paused, only continued its dependable rhythm. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Time moved gently through the farmhouse, almost unnoticed. Without newspapers arriving every morning or constant messages demanding attention, evenings belonged almost entirely to reflection. Thomas often thought about the changes taking place across the colonies. New settlements continued appearing farther inland. Roads gradually improved. More ships crossed the Atlantic each year, bringing families searching for new beginnings. Yet here, within the quiet valley, life remained wonderfully familiar. The same stars, the same forest, the same changing seasons. History advanced slowly enough that ordinary people could still feel connected to the land beneath their feet. As the fire settled lower, Elizabeth gently gathered the newly spun thread into neat bundles. Mary folded away her sewing. Samuel admired the finished wooden spoon, running his hand across its smooth surface before placing it beside the others. Another useful object had quietly entered the household. Nothing grand, nothing expensive, simply something made with care. Outside, a cool breeze stirred the highest branches of the maple trees. Several final leaves drifted silently toward the earth. Soon winter would claim the valley. Snow would cover the fields. Ice would form along the creek. The evenings would grow even longer. But tonight, within the warm shelter of their sturdy farmhouse, surrounded by handmade tools, glowing embers, and the peaceful company of family, the Carter household embraced another calm autumn night. One more gentle chapter in the quiet history of ordinary Americans whose greatest legacy was not fame, but the steady, thoughtful lives they built one peaceful evening at a time. The fire had settled into a deep, steady glow by the time the family prepared for bed. Bright flames were no longer necessary. Instead, the heavy oak logs burned slowly, producing a rich bed of glowing coals that filled the farmhouse with lasting warmth. Thomas always believed that a quiet fire was wiser than a noisy one. A roaring blaze consumed wood too quickly, while a patient fire remained useful until sunrise. Outside, the moon had reached its highest point in the sky. Its cool silver light rested upon the roof of the barn, the tops of the split-rail fences, and the broad branches of the ancient white oak. Every object cast long, gentle shadows across the frost-covered ground. The countryside seemed almost frozen in time. Yet if someone had listened carefully, they would have heard countless small sounds continuing throughout the wilderness. A field mouse rustling beneath dry leaves, the distant splash of a fish breaking the surface of the creek, the gentle flutter of an owl's wings as it glided silently between towering pines. The wilderness never truly became silent. It simply whispered instead of speaking. Inside the farmhouse, Elizabeth carefully folded the last blanket resting across the rocking chair. Blankets received careful attention in colonial homes. Many were woven by hand from sheep's wool grown upon the family's own pasture. Others were pieced together from older clothing that had become too worn for daily use. A single quilt often represented years of careful sewing, with every patch carrying memories of garments once worn by parents, grandparents, or growing children. Nothing was forgotten. Even worn fabric found new purpose. Mary extinguished the final beeswax candle using a small brass snuffer. A faint curl of fragrant smoke rose gently into the air before disappearing above the hearth. Only the fireplace now illuminated the room. Its orange light reflected softly across polished wooden bowls stacked neatly upon open shelves, iron cooking pots hanging beside the chimney, and the spinning wheel quietly resting near the window. Every familiar object seemed peaceful. Every tool had completed another day's work. Thomas stepped toward the front door and lifted the wooden latch just enough to look outside one final time. Cold air slipped gently into the room. He smiled as he admired the stars. The Milky Way stretched brilliantly across the heavens from one horizon to the other. Modern historians often remind us that 18th century Americans experienced some of the darkest, and therefore most spectacular, night skis in history. Without electric lights, smoke pollution, or brightly illuminated cities, even faint stars appeared with astonishing clarity. Many travelers described feeling humbled beneath such skis. Thomas understood exactly why. Standing beneath that endless blanket of stars reminded him that every human life formed only a small part of a much greater story. He quietly secured the door once again. The thick oak beams slid firmly into place. Simple, strong, reliable, colonial door locks rarely looked impressive. They did not need to. Most security came from solid construction, trusted neighbors, loyal dogs, and communities where everyone recognized one another. Samuel spread fresh ash gently over the glowing embers. This familiar evening ritual reduced airflow while protecting enough heat to preserve the fire until morning. It was one of those ordinary skills rarely mentioned in written history, yet nearly every colonial household depended upon it. A surviving fire saved precious time, saved precious fuel. Sometimes it even saved lives during severe winter storms. Little Hannah yawned softly before climbing beneath her heavy wool blanket. Her rag doll rested beside her pillow exactly where it always did. Elizabeth tucked the blanket carefully around her shoulders before gently brushing a loose curl away from her face. Within moments, Hannah had already drifted into peaceful sleep. Children often fell asleep quickly after days spent outdoors. Fresh air, physical activity, and the absence of constant distractions created wonderfully restful evenings. Thomas sat quietly for one final moment before the fire. He did not speak. He simply listened. The gentle breathing of his family, the slow ticking of the grandfather clock, the quiet settling of old timber, the faint wind brushing against the outside walls. Each sound reminded him that everything remained exactly as it should. History often celebrates moments of great change, battles, discoveries, declarations, kings, presidents, explorers. Yet ordinary evenings like this quietly shaped the lives of millions of people whose names would never appear in history books. Farmers, carpenters, blacksmiths, mothers, children, neighbors. They built homes, raised families, shared knowledge, protected traditions, prepared carefully for tomorrow. Without realizing it, they became the foundation upon which future generations would build an entire nation. Outside, The frost thickened across the fields. The creek flowed steadily beneath the moonlight. The ancient white oak stood watch over the sleeping farm just as it had watched countless seasons come and go before. And within the warm shelter of the Carter farmhouse, surrounded by glowing embers and handmade comforts, another peaceful colonial night settled gently over the land, reminding anyone willing to listen that true survival in the 1700s depended not upon extraordinary courage every day, but upon thousands of small, thoughtful habits repeated faithfully, one quiet evening after another. The night slowly drifted toward its quiet conclusion. Hours had passed since the last candle was extinguished, yet the farmhouse remained gently warmed by the faithful embers resting beneath their blanket of ash. Outside, the moon had begun its slow descent toward the western horizon, while the brightest stars continued shining above the endless forests of colonial America. This was the coldest part of the night. The warmth gathered during the afternoon had long since disappeared from the fields. Frost covered the pasture so completely that it appeared almost as though a light snowfall had settled across the valley. Every fence rail, every fallen leaf, and every blade of grass glittered beneath the moonlight. Inside the house, the Carter family slept peacefully. Thomas breathed slowly beneath his heavy wool blanket. Elizabeth rested quietly beside him. Mary, Samuel, and little Hannah dreamed beneath quilts stitched by hands that had loved them long before this autumn evening. Those quilts carried stories. One square had once belonged to Thomas's childhood shirt. Another came from Elizabeth's wedding dress. Several patches had been cut from Mary's first winter cloak after she outgrew it. In colonial homes, quilts often became living family histories sewn together one careful stitch at a time. Nothing valuable was forgotten. Nothing meaningful disappeared. Outside, the wilderness quietly continued its ancient routines. A fox followed the edge of the creek, its paws leaving delicate prints in the frost. Far overhead, migrating geese crossed the night sky, guided by the stars toward warmer southern wetlands. Even the wind seemed to move with unusual gentleness, whispering through the bare branches of the old white oak standing beside the orchard. That great tree had watched over countless nights like this, before the farmhouse existed, before fences divided the fields, before wagons traveled the nearby road, long before history remembered the names of those who now slept beneath its branches. Trees often outlived entire generations. They silently witnessed the changing world without ever leaving the place where they first took root. Perhaps there was wisdom in that. Inside the barn, the horse stirred briefly before returning to sleep. The sheep remained huddled together beneath their thick wool. The milk cow slowly chewed her cud, completely untroubled by the quiet darkness surrounding her. Animals trusted the night. They accepted its rhythms without fear. People who lived close to nature often learned to do the same. The old grandfather clock quietly continued measuring the passing hours. Its steady pendulum swung with remarkable patience. Tick-tock, tick-tock, nothing hurried, nothing paused. Time simply continued its endless journey. Colonial families understood something that modern life often forgets. Every season deserved its own pace. Spring asked for planting. Summer rewarded labor. Autumn required preparation. Winter invited reflection. Trying to rush any season accomplished very little. Nature refused to hurry. Thomas had often explained this to Samuel while working together in the fields. "You cannot pull the wheat upward to make it grow faster," he once said with a quiet smile. "You simply care for it every day until harvest arrives." The lesson reached far beyond farming. It described life itself. Outside, the eastern horizon showed the faintest hint of pale gray. Dawn still remained distant. Yet the night had quietly begun, surrendering its darkness. Soon the first songbirds would awaken. The rooster would announce another morning. Fresh smoke would once again rise from the farmhouse chimney. The familiar rhythm of another colonial day would begin. Elizabeth would prepare breakfast. Thomas would inspect the fields. Samuel would care for the livestock. Mary would tend the household. Little Hannah would discover some new wonder hidden within the ordinary beauty of the farm. And as surely as the sun would cross the autumn sky, evening would return once more. Another fire would be prepared, another meal shared, another peaceful hour before darkness welcomed with gratitude rather than fear. For this was the true secret of survival in a 1700s home. Not dramatic adventures, not constant danger, but quiet discipline, careful planning, strong family bonds, respect for nature, and the willingness to find comfort in simple routines repeated with patience, season after season. The Carter family's names may never appear in famous history books. No grand monument would ever celebrate their ordinary days. Yet families like theirs built the foundation of early America, not through moments of glory, but through steady hands, warm hearths, thoughtful preparation, and countless peaceful evenings spent beneath one of the most beautiful night skis the world has ever known. As the final stars slowly faded above the sleeping valley, another chapter of their quiet history came gently to a close, carried forward by the same timeless rhythm that had guided ordinary people for generations, and would continue long after the embers of this humble farmhouse had finally grown cold. Morning returned with quiet certainty, just as it always had. Before the first rays of sunlight reached the Carter farmhouse, the eastern horizon glowed with a soft ribbon of pale blue. The stars faded one by one, not disappearing all at once, but gently surrendering the sky to the coming day. A cool mist drifted across the meadow, wrapping itself around the split-rail fences before slowly lifting toward the forest. Thomas awoke naturally. For a brief moment, he remained still beneath his blanket, listening. The familiar sounds greeted him, the steady ticking of the grandfather clock, the quiet breathing of his family, the faint crackle of surviving embers beneath the fireplace ash. Everything was peaceful, everything was exactly as it should be. He rose quietly, pulled on his wool coat, and knelt before the hearth. With the iron poker, he carefully moved the ash aside. There they were, tiny glowing coals, still alive. Thomas smiled to himself. Every successful morning seemed to begin with those small glowing embers. He placed a handful of dry cedar shavings above them, followed by several thin sticks of kindling, a gentle breath, a faint curl of smoke. Then, almost magically, a small yellow flame appeared. Within only a few minutes, another day's fire had been born from yesterday's careful preparation. That single lesson captured much of colonial life. Today's comfort almost always depended upon yesterday's effort. Outside, the first robin landed upon the old fence beside the garden. Its cheerful song echoed softly through the cool morning air. Soon another answered from the apple orchard. Within minutes, dozens of birds filled the valley with music. Colonial Americans often began their mornings long before sunrise, especially during harvest season. Without electric lights, daylight became the most valuable resource of all. Every hour of sunshine mattered. Elizabeth soon joined Thomas beside the hearth. She smiled as warmth slowly spread throughout the farmhouse once again. Without exchanging many words, they began another familiar morning routine. Fresh water from the bucket beside the fireplace was poured into the iron kettle. Cornmeal was measured into a wooden bowl. Yesterday's bread was sliced carefully so that not a single crumb would be wasted. Breakfast remained simple, yet it provided exactly what the family needed: warm porridge, fresh milk, bread spread with homemade butter, sometimes a little apple preserves from the cellar. Colonial meals were rarely extravagant. Their greatest strength was consistency. Food provided energy, energy sustained work, work sustained life. Samuel stepped outside carrying a woven basket. The grass crunched softly beneath his boots where frost still covered the ground. As he opened the chicken coop, the hens greeted him with familiar clucks, eager to begin another day. Each fresh egg he collected represented more than breakfast. Eggs could be traded with neighbors, sold at market, saved for baking, or carefully set aside for hatching new chicks in spring. Even ordinary things carried many possibilities. Little Hannah wandered onto the porch wrapped tightly in a small wool shawl. She looked toward the eastern sky with sleepy eyes. The sunrise had begun. Soft pink clouds stretched above the distant hills, while golden light slowly spilled across the fields. To Hannah, every sunrise looked different. To Thomas, every sunrise felt like a quiet promise. No matter how difficult yesterday had been, the land always offered another opportunity to begin again. The old white oak beside the orchard glowed beautifully beneath the first sunlight. Tiny birds darted among its branches. searching for insects hidden beneath rough bark. The great tree had survived storms, droughts, harsh winters, and countless seasons of change. Yet every spring it produced fresh leaves once again. Its quiet endurance inspired Thomas more than he could easily explain. As the morning brightened, smoke once again drifted from the farmhouse chimney. Across the valley, other thin columns of smoke appeared as neighboring families also awakened their hearths. Though separated by miles of woodland and farmland, their mornings unfolded in remarkably similar ways. Someone nearby was chopping kindling. Another family was drawing water. A mother somewhere was baking bread. Children were feeding livestock. The colonies were still young, but thousands of ordinary households shared these peaceful rhythms every single day. Historians often focus on governors, merchants, soldiers, and political leaders. Yet the strength of early America rested just as much within homes like this one. Families who planted gardens, repaired fences, shared harvests, helped neighbors during illness, raised children with patience, prepared carefully for every season. Their names rarely appeared in official records. Still, their quiet work shaped the future just as surely as any famous speech or historic document. Thomas stood beside the porch once more, warming his hands around a wooden cup filled with hot cider. The valley stretched before him, peaceful beneath the growing sunlight, the forest, the creek, the orchard, the barn, the garden, the smoke rising gently into the crisp autumn air. Everything reminded him that survival in the 1700s was never about conquering nature. It was about understanding it, working beside it, respecting its seasons, preparing with wisdom, and finding deep contentment in simple days that began with glowing embers and ended with grateful hearts. As another calm morning unfolded across the colonial countryside, the Carter family stepped quietly into a new day. One more peaceful chapter in a history written not with noise or urgency, but with patience, kindness, resilience, and the timeless comfort of home. The morning unfolded with an unhurried grace that seemed to belong only to the 18th century. The sun climbed steadily above the eastern hills, warming the frost that had covered the fields before dawn. Tiny droplets of water now sparkled upon every blade of grass, catching the light like thousands of scattered diamonds. Before long, the last traces of frost disappeared, leaving behind the rich scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. Thomas believed this fragrance carried the true spirit of autumn. It spoke of harvest, preparation, rest, and the quiet promise that winter, though demanding, could be met with confidence if the family remained diligent. He walked toward the small split-rail fence surrounding the kitchen garden. Several rows of late-season cabbage still stood firm against the cooling weather. The carrots rested safely beneath the soil, protected from light frosts. Parsnips, in fact, often tasted sweeter after the first cold nights of the season, because the plants naturally converted some of their starch into sugar. Colonial farmers had observed this long before scientists understood why it happened. Experience often became the greatest teacher. Elizabeth stepped into the root cellar beneath the farmhouse. The cool underground room remained one of the most valuable parts of the home. Built partly below ground, the cellar stayed remarkably cold throughout the year without any modern refrigeration. Wooden shelves held carefully arranged jars of preserved fruit. Clay crocks contained salted meat. Bins filled with potatoes, onions, turnips, carrots, and apples lined the walls. Everything had its proper place. Air circulated freely. Moisture remained carefully controlled. A well-managed root cellar could mean the difference between comfort and hardship during a long winter. She carefully inspected every shelf. One apple showed the first signs of spoilage. Without hesitation, she removed it. A single spoiled apple could quickly affect those beside it. The old saying proved true then, just as it does today. Attention to small details often prevented larger problems. Outside, Samuel repaired a loose fence rail damaged by last week's strong winds. He selected a straight piece of seasoned oak from the woodpile and carefully fitted it into place. Colonial fences required constant maintenance. Unlike modern wire fencing, wooden rails gradually weathered beneath rain, snow, and summer heat. Every season demanded repairs. Yet those same fences protected gardens from hungry deer, livestock from wandering, and valuable crops from being trampled. Simple barriers quietly preserved months of hard work. Mary carried a basket of freshly washed linens toward the clothesline stretched between two sturdy maple trees. The cool autumn breeze proved perfect for drying fabric, as white linen shirts and wool aprons swayed gently beneath the bright blue sky. They almost resembled the sails of distant ships crossing the Atlantic Ocean. That thought made Mary smile. She had never seen the ocean herself, yet every object inside the farmhouse carried some connection to it. Iron tools from England, seeds brought by earlier settlers, family traditions that had crossed thousands of miles aboard crowded sailing vessels. The colonies continued growing, but memories of the old world still lingered quietly within everyday life. Little Hannah wandered beside the creek, carrying only a small wicker basket. She searched for smooth stones and colorful feathers, while tiny fish darted through the clear water below. Dragonflies hovered above the surface like tiny blue jewels catching the sunlight. A painted turtle rested peacefully upon a fallen log, warming itself beneath the gentle autumn sun. Children growing up on the frontier often developed a close relationship with nature simply because it surrounded every part of their daily lives. They learned the songs of birds before reading books. They recognized animal tracks before studying maps. The land became both playground and classroom. Around midday, Thomas paused beneath the great white oak once again. Its leaves had become fewer now. Every passing breeze carried another handful gently toward the earth. He reached down and picked up a single acorn, small enough to fit comfortably within his hand. Yet hidden inside rested the possibility of another mighty oak, perhaps one that would still stand 200 years from now. The thought filled him with quiet wonder. History often grows from very small beginnings. A seed, a family, a simple farmhouse, a single careful decision repeated faithfully over many years. Across the valley, the church bell from a distant meeting house echoed faintly through the crisp afternoon air. Its sound carried much farther in the cool autumn weather than during summer. Although the building stood several miles away, the gentle ringing reminded scattered families that they belonged to something larger than their individual farms. Churches served not only as places of worship, but also as gathering places where neighbors exchanged news, offered assistance, celebrated marriages, and welcomed new arrivals. Community strengthened survival. No family truly lived alone. As the bell's final echo disappeared among the hills, Thomas looked across his peaceful farm. The barn stood strong. The orchard rested quietly. The chimney released another ribbon of smoke. His family worked contentedly, each person contributing in small but meaningful ways. There was no applause for these ordinary tasks, no audience, no celebration. Only the quiet satisfaction that came from caring well for the people, the land, and the home entrusted to them. Perhaps that was the greatest lesson hidden within the history of survival in a 1700s home. True strength rarely announced itself with loud voices or dramatic moments. Instead, it revealed itself through patient hands, thoughtful preparation, humble routines, and countless ordinary afternoons like this one, where every simple task quietly helped carry a family safely toward another peaceful hour before darkness. The afternoon sun slowly began its gentle journey toward the western hills once again. The shadows beneath the orchard grew longer with every passing moment, stretching quietly across the grass, as though the land itself were preparing for another peaceful evening. The Carter family did not need to be reminded that daylight was precious. Every member of the household could sense its gradual fading. The rhythm had become part of them. Thomas finished repairing the last section of the pasture fence and rested both hands upon the smooth top rail. He looked across the valley where fields of harvested corn blended into distant forests painted with brilliant shades of crimson, amber, and deep gold. Autumn was reaching its final weeks. Soon the colorful leaves would disappear. Soon the first lasting snow would arrive. Yet there was no sadness in the changing season, only gratitude. Every completed harvest represented another year of careful work rewarded by the land. Nearby, Samuel carried several more split oak logs into the woodshed. The growing stack reached nearly to the roof now. Thomas often explained that a large woodpile meant more than warmth. It represented peace of mind. Families who entered winter with abundant firewood slept more comfortably during long December nights. Cold weather could be endured. Running out of fuel was far more dangerous. Historians estimate that an average colonial farmhouse consumed many cords of firewood each year, not only for heating but also for cooking, baking, washing clothes, heating water, preserving food, and countless other daily tasks. Fire truly remained the center of every home. Elizabeth spread fresh apple slices across wooden drying racks positioned near the warm hearth. The gentle heat would slowly remove their moisture over several days. Properly dried apples remained delicious throughout winter and could be added to porridge, bread, or stews. Food preservation required remarkable patience. Nothing happened quickly. Everything relied upon careful attention. Mary stepped into the linen cupboard and carefully counted every folded blanket, heavy wool quilts, linen sheets, extra shawls. Everything appeared clean, dry, and ready for the colder weeks ahead. Preparation always brought quiet confidence. The better a family prepared during autumn, the more peacefully they welcomed winter. Little Hannah wandered toward the old white oak carrying only a small wooden stool. She climbed onto it carefully and reached for one of the tree's lowest branches. Attached, there was a simple swing that Thomas had built during the previous spring. The thick hemp rope remained strong. The smooth wooden seat had been polished by countless afternoons of gentle play. She pushed herself softly back and forth, not high, not fast, just enough to feel the cool breeze against her face. Above her, hundreds of leaves shimmered softly beneath the afternoon sunlight. A few drifted downward around her like slow golden snowflakes. She laughed quietly. Thomas watched from across the yard. Moments like these reminded him why every difficult day's work mattered: the farmhouse, the fences, the orchard, the warm meals, the stacked firewood. All of it existed so that children could enjoy simple afternoons without worry. That, he believed, was a life well lived. Far beyond the Carter farm, a lone rider appeared upon the distant road. His horse moved at an easy walking pace, carrying a pair of saddlebags filled with letters and small parcels. Traveling post riders had become increasingly important as the colonies continued growing. Though mail remained slow by modern standards, these riders connected distant settlements with families, merchants, and government officials across hundreds of miles. The rider tipped his hat politely while passing the farmhouse. Thomas returned the greeting. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Courtesy between strangers remained an important part of frontier life. Every traveler understood that one day he too might depend upon the kindness of an unfamiliar household. The rider disappeared beyond the next hill, leaving only the faint sound of hoofbeats gradually fading into the peaceful countryside. Elizabeth glanced toward the western sky. The sunlight had become softer now. She smiled gently. It was almost time. The hour before darkness was returning once again. Without any spoken instructions, everyone naturally began their familiar evening routines. Samuel closed the chicken coop. Mary gathered the drying laundry. Thomas checked the barn doors and secured the wagon beneath its shelter. Elizabeth stirred the evening stew, waiting patiently above the hearth. The farmhouse slowly filled with comforting aromas of onions, herbs, carrots, fresh bread, and smoked pork. Outside, the first cool breath of evening drifted across the valley. The birds gradually quieted. The crickets prepared to sing. The old white oak released another gentle shower of golden leaves that settled silently across the yard. Thomas paused one final time before entering the house. He looked across the peaceful landscape that had become his family's home. No palace stood before him, no grand estate. Only a modest farmhouse built by determined hands. Yet within those sturdy walls lived something more valuable than riches: security earned through preparation, joy discovered in ordinary days, strength shared among family, hope carried from one season into the next. As the first evening star appeared above the western horizon, the Carter family stepped indoors together, welcoming once again the quiet hour before darkness, the cherished hour that had shaped generations of colonial Americans, reminding them every single evening that survival was never built in a single heroic moment, but patiently crafted through thousands of small acts of wisdom, gratitude, and love. The first evening star shone brightly above the western horizon, and almost as if answering its silent signal, the valley settled into another peaceful night. Inside the farmhouse, the warmth of the hearth welcomed everyone home once again. Thomas removed his weathered hat and hung it upon the familiar wooden peg beside the door. His boots carried a thin layer of dry earth from the fields, a quiet reminder of another honest day's work completed before sunset. Elizabeth placed the heavy iron pot in the center of the oak table. Steam rose gently into the room. The comforting aroma of fresh vegetables, herbs, barley, and smoked pork blended with the scent of warm bread cooling beside the fireplace. It was not an extravagant meal, but it was abundant enough for colonial families. Abundance rarely meant luxury. It meant having enough to share. Before anyone lifted a spoon, the family paused together in grateful silence. Outside, darkness slowly settled across the hills, while inside the farmhouse, the fire painted every face with a soft golden glow. No expensive decorations were needed. The warmth itself became the home's greatest beauty. After supper, Thomas carried his wooden chair onto the porch. The air had grown colder, but it remained wonderfully still. Above him stretched one of the clearest autumn skies imaginable. Thousands upon thousands of stars covered the heavens. The Milky Way formed a bright ribbon across the night, so vivid that it almost appeared to cast its own gentle light upon the sleeping countryside. He often wondered how many generations before him had admired that very same sky. Native peoples had looked upward from these forests long before European settlers arrived. Early explorers had navigated unfamiliar rivers beneath these same stars. His own grandparents had crossed the Atlantic guided by many of those constellations. The sky connected every generation. It never belonged to one lifetime alone. Inside, Mary quietly folded the freshly washed linens while Elizabeth carefully inspected tomorrow's baking flour stored inside a large wooden barrel. Good flour had to remain dry. Even a small amount of moisture invited spoilage. Household management demanded constant awareness of such details. It was invisible work, yet essential work. Samuel sat beside the fire reading several pages from the family Bible. Books were treasured possessions in the 18th century. Many homes owned only a few. Each volume received careful handling, often lasting through several generations before needing replacement. Knowledge itself carried great value because it was not easily replaced. Little Hannah slowly drifted to sleep while listening to the gentle crackling of the fire. The sound had comforted children for countless generations. Long before recorded music, radios, or electric lights, the hearth offered warmth, light, conversation, and peaceful companionship. It truly formed the heart of the colonial home. Outside, the wind stirred gently through the orchard. Only a handful of apples still clung to the branches. Most had already been gathered, preserved, or shared with neighbors. The harvest season was nearly complete. Soon the land would rest beneath winter's quiet blanket. Thomas smiled as he looked toward the old white oak. Even stripped of many leaves, it remained strong. Its roots reached deeply into the earth. Its branches stretched confidently toward the stars. It had survived countless winters before. It would survive many more. In many ways, Thomas hoped his own family would resemble that ancient tree, steady, patient, resilient, grounded by strong roots. As the fire slowly settled into glowing embers, Elizabeth covered the remaining loaf of bread with a clean linen cloth. Tomorrow morning it would still be fresh enough for breakfast. Nothing needed to be wasted. Nothing needed to be rushed. The day's work had ended. Tomorrow's work would arrive in its own time. The grandfather clock quietly marked another passing hour. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Its rhythm blended with the breathing of the sleeping house. Outside, the moon rose above the eastern forest, bathing the valley in silver light. The creek continued its endless journey. The barn stood peacefully beneath the stars. The orchard rested. The fields waited patiently for another sunrise. And within the sturdy walls of one modest farmhouse, another ordinary evening came gently to an end. History would never record the date. No famous visitor would write about it. No newspaper would mention it. Yet evenings like this formed the quiet foundation of early America. Millions of ordinary people survived not because life was easy, but because they understood the value of preparation, cooperation, gratitude, and steady daily work. Their greatest achievements were not monuments of stone. They were warm homes, healthy families, strong communities, and generations of children who grew up believing that peace could often be found in the simple routine of gathering around a glowing hearth before darkness settled over the land. As the last ember faded into a soft crimson glow, and the Carter farmhouse surrendered once more to the calm embrace of night, the timeless lesson of their quiet life remained beautifully clear. The hour before darkness was never merely the end of a day. It was the moment when love, preparation, faith, and family came together beneath one humble roof, ensuring that when morning returned, hope would be waiting beside the fire once again. The seasons continued turning, just as they always had. Days became shorter. The morning frost arrived earlier. The evenings grew longer. Yet inside the Carter farmhouse, the familiar rhythm never lost its quiet beauty. One calm day blended gently into the next, and in that steady pattern the family found a kind of happiness that required no grand celebration. Winter finally announced its arrival one peaceful morning. When Thomas opened the front door before sunrise, the valley had been transformed. A blanket of fresh snow covered every field, every fence, every rooftop, and every branch of the ancient white oak. The world looked softer now, wrapped in silence so complete that even the distant creek seemed to flow more gently beneath its thin covering of ice. Thomas smiled. Everything had been prepared. The woodshed stood completely full. The pantry shelves remained well stocked. The root cellar held enough vegetables to last many weeks. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the kitchen beams. Smoked meat rested safely inside the smokehouse. Warm blankets filled every wooden chest. Nothing had been left to chance. The long autumn of careful preparation had quietly become the comfort of winter. Elizabeth placed another log upon the fire. The dry oak caught almost immediately, filling the farmhouse with steady warmth. Outside, snowflakes continued drifting gently through the still morning air. Inside, breakfast simmered above the hearth while fresh bread baked inside the brick oven built beside the chimney. The contrast between the cold outdoors and the welcoming warmth inside reminded Thomas why a well-kept home meant so much in the 18th century. A house was never simply a building. It was protection. It was hope. It was survival. Samuel stepped outside carrying a wooden shovel. Fresh snow blocked part of the narrow path leading toward the barn. With slow, steady movements, he cleared the walkway before the drifting snow became deeper. Winter demanded different work than autumn. The fences required watching after heavy storms. The animals needed extra feed. Water buckets sometimes froze overnight. Firewood disappeared much faster than expected. Yet because the family had prepared carefully, none of these duties felt overwhelming. Preparation transformed hardship into routine. Little Hannah stood quietly beside the frosted window. She watched snowflakes dancing through the air with wide eyes. Each one appeared different. Each one disappeared gently upon the ground. Elizabeth smiled as she wrapped Hannah in a warm wool shawl before opening the door. Together they stepped outside for only a few moments. The crisp winter air filled their lungs. Fresh snow crunched softly beneath their boots. The old white oak stood proudly against the pale gray sky, its powerful branches carrying fresh snow like a white blanket. Even in winter, the ancient tree remained beautiful. Its strength did not depend upon leaves, only upon deep roots. Thomas often thought people should learn from trees. Storms would always arrive. Seasons would always change. Yet strong roots allowed both trees and families to endure. That afternoon, the family gathered near the fireplace while snow continued falling beyond the windows. Mary spun wool into thread. Elizabeth repaired a quilt. Samuel carved another wooden spoon. Thomas quietly repaired a leather harness. Hannah listened as her father described the first winter he had spent in the valley many years earlier. The farmhouse had been smaller then, the woodshed nearly empty. Every snowfall had seemed uncertain. But each passing season had taught another lesson. Each year brought greater knowledge, greater confidence, greater gratitude. History often remembers wars, famous speeches, and powerful leaders. But the true story of 18th century America also lived inside thousands of homes like this one. Homes where ordinary families quietly overcame ordinary challenges, where children learned honesty by watching their parents, where neighbors shared food during difficult winters, where every loaf of bread, every carefully stacked log, every repaired fence, and every glowing fire became small victories worth celebrating. The Carter family would never become famous. Generations later, few people would know their names. Yet they represented countless real families whose patience, resilience, and kindness shaped the growing American colonies. They survived not through extraordinary strength alone, but through ordinary wisdom practiced every single day. As evening returned once again, the familiar hour before darkness settled gently over the snow-covered valley. The fire crackled peacefully. The kettle quietly steamed. Outside, the winter wind whispered through the branches of the old white oak. Inside, the farmhouse glowed with warmth, comfort, and quiet contentment. Thomas looked around the room one final time before adding another log to the fire. His family was safe. The home was warm. The pantry remained full. Tomorrow would bring another sunrise, and that was enough. For in the end, the greatest lesson of survival in a 1700s home was wonderfully simple. A peaceful life was not built in a single remarkable day. It was built one sunrise at a time, one careful decision at a time, one shared meal at a time, one quiet evening at a time, and always one precious hour before darkness. Years passed quietly across the little valley, just as the seasons always had. Children grew taller, the old white oak grew wider, the split-rail fences were repaired again and again. The orchard bloomed every spring, filled the air with the sweet fragrance of blossoms, and offered another harvest each autumn. Life did not remain unchanged, but its rhythm remained beautifully familiar. Thomas's hair slowly turned the color of fresh winter snow. The strength in his hands remained, though they moved with a little more care than before. Every line upon his face told the story of thousands of ordinary days spent beneath the open sky. Days of planting, days of harvest, days of repairing, days of preparing. He often smiled when visitors called his life simple, simple perhaps, but never empty. One cool autumn evening, many years after the family had first settled in the valley, Thomas walked slowly toward the great white oak. The tree had become larger than ever. Its branches stretched across the fatting sky like welcoming arms. He rested one hand against its rough bark. The tree had watched Hannah grow from a little girl into a young woman. It had shaded Samuel while he learned to split firewood. It had sheltered Mary as she stitched clothing beneath its leaves. It had stood beside the farmhouse through wind, rain, snow, and countless peaceful sunsets. It had become part of the family. Thomas looked across the valley one final time before the evening meal. The fields were ready for another winter. The barn remained strong. The smokehouse was full. The woodshed overflowed with neatly stacked oak. Everything stood exactly as it should. He realized then that survival had never truly been about escaping danger. It had been about creating stability, about building a place where each new generation could begin life with a little more comfort than the one before. That was the quiet triumph of ordinary families throughout colonial America. Not wealth, not fame, but continuity. As darkness slowly approached, the familiar routines began once again. Elizabeth stirred a pot of stew over the fire. Fresh bread cooled upon the table. The kettle sang softly above glowing embers. Outside, the chickens settled into their coop. The horse rested comfortably inside the barn. The first evening star appeared exactly where Thomas expected to find it. Nothing about the moment seemed extraordinary, yet perhaps that was exactly why it mattered. History often searches for dramatic endings. Real life rarely offers them. Instead, it continues through ordinary evenings just like this one. One generation quietly teaching the next. One family passing along knowledge earned through experience. One warm hearth welcoming tired hands home after another honest day. As the family gathered together for supper, laughter mixed gently with conversation. The fire crackled. The grandfather clock marked another passing hour. The wind whispered softly outside. The old white oak stood watch beneath the growing stars. Everything felt complete. If someone had traveled through the valley centuries later, the farmhouse might no longer remain. The fences would eventually disappear. The orchard might return to forest. Even the road could change its course. Yet the values built within that little home would continue far beyond its wooden walls: patience, preparation, respect for nature, kindness toward neighbors, gratitude for simple blessings. Those lessons never grow old. They belong to every generation. And perhaps that is the greatest reason stories like this continue to comfort people today. They remind us that even in a world without electricity, automobiles, telephones, or modern conveniences, people still found deep happiness, not because life was easy, but because they appreciated ordinary moments: the smell of fresh bread, the warmth of a winter fire, the laughter of children, the beauty of stars untouched by city lights, the quiet satisfaction of knowing tomorrow had already been prepared for. As another peaceful evening settled over the valley, the Carter farmhouse glowed warmly beneath the endless American sky. The fire continued burning. The family rested together. Outside, darkness gently embraced the land. And somewhere beyond the old white oak, the wind carried forward the quiet story of one ordinary colonial family. A story not of kings or battles, but of resilience, love, thoughtful preparation, and the timeless comfort of home. The hour before darkness had never been a time to fear. It had always been a gentle reminder that the truest measure of a life was not found in extraordinary moments, but in the countless peaceful evenings spent caring for those we love. And with that quiet truth resting softly upon the valley, the Carter family welcomed another calm night, while history itself moved gently onward, one sunset at a time. **The end.